Fat Moose Comics, established in 1982, is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store. Led by current owner Sean Hendricks, Moose has that rare, old-school comic shop feel and camaraderie, yet also remains a welcoming space for new fans. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you are in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. My love of the TV series Smallville is well documented, and there's one Smallville podcast that's always at the top of my queue. Always Hold On to Smallville, hosted by our pal, Zach Moore. Zach and his guests bring great insight, passion, and humor to each and every episode, and the podcast will continue with more great Smallville and Superman talk even after their series coverage concludes. Listen wherever you get podcasts, and keep an eye out for the other shows under the Always Hold On To banner, including Arrow, Star Wars, and more. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss the New 52 Action Comics run by writer Grant Morrison is Morrison acolyte and returning guest Mike Sangregorio. Welcome back.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Do you prefer acolyte, disciple, prophet? I feel like any of these apply to you when it comes to the works of one Grant Morrison.
I like acolyte because I don't actually know what the word means. Disciple feels a little weird considering I've never actually held a long conversation with the man, and prophet that ain't working well considering that he's still alive. But today is his 65th birthday, so I was very excited when you told me we were recording today because I feel like, what's more fitting to discuss this underrated but significant work than on the man's 65th birthday.
Yeah, it really is something. I'm very happy with how the timing worked out. So yes, happy birthday to Grant Morrison, 65 on the day of this recording. And people will hear this episode just a few days later. So very cool how that worked out. This was totally an accident. I do plan a lot and I plan far in advance, but I had no idea about this until you told me. I'm like, perfect.
I was shocked when you said it. I was like, oh, you chose that specifically, right? And you were like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And I'm like, well, that's pop magic, as he says.
So this is the run of Action Comics during the New 52 era that Morrison wrote. I'll list his artistic contributors and we'll talk about the backup stories. We'll go through everything. But this was the run from Action Comics numbers 0 through 18 from 2011 to 2013. And I feel like I have to give a special shout out to / apology to our mutual friend, Ralph Puma. Because this is the second time now, I feel so bad. This is the second time where he and I have done an episode of this podcast about a Grant Morrison work. And he's had to suffer through me being like, I don't really love this. I don't get it. It's not totally working for me. And then I revisit the work in a subsequent episode with you. And I'm like, this is great. I've seen the light. I love it now. It happened with Final Crisis. And sorry to Ralph, but I am also happy to say it's now happened again with the Morrison run on Action Comics. I have seen the light. Whoa, did I love this. And I had the best experience I've ever had with this run compared to my prior readings. So I'm so happy, so excited. But Ralph, I'm so sorry.
That actually makes a lot of sense to me because I feel like I'm the 101. Ralph is the advanced class. Like you need a lot of prep work. You can't just jump in that pool. You really got to learn how to swim before you talk with Ralph about something like dense like this. But I'm the 101. I don't have the brain for it, so I have to like break it down to the simplest terms. So I think that makes a lot of sense. This is the remedial course people need to get into this stuff.
Well, I think it's just that Ralph, he just kind of primes me, I guess, so that the next time I go to read it, I have that I'm armed with that conversation and I can kind of access the work in a different way. We'll get specific as we always do. We have some great patron questions and comments that we'll get to, but I'll start, as I typically do, with that overall question. Your history, your experience with this run? Tell me about it. And have your feelings towards this run changed at all over the years? And as always, I'm floored by the passage of time. In my mind, this is a relatively recent run, but it started almost 14 years ago. So over the span of time, what's your relationship been with this particular run?
I bought this when it came out. This was one of the very few titles for the New 52 that I picked up right there and then, because it was Grant Morrison, but also because obviously it harkens back to the Golden Age Superman, for which I've spoken my love for in previous episodes. I loved it at the time. I love it now. I've read it many, many times between now and then. It was funny, the New 52, the issues were coming out right as I got married. So it's very easy for me to remember like where I was when I was reading this, or, Red Hood and the Outlaws, or some of the other ones that I was really excited for that haven't aged as well. Cause it's like, it's all wedding prep stuff. So it really burns itself into my memory.
Understood. What format or formats do you own this series in?
So this was one of the very first series that I bought on Comixology. So I figured that, the New 52, since it was being offered, it was a great opportunity to switch to digital, which I had already started to do with other stuff. And it just felt right. It was like, this is Action Comics Volume 2. This is the first time it's been relaunched in any significant way. Morrison's making a big deal out of it. It feels like this is a cool way to make the switch. So I have all the issues on Comixology. I don't have any of the hardcover editions just because every time I offer to lend this out, everyone's like, nah, it's okay. I'm going to skip it. So I haven't had a reason to go out and buy it. But I will say that I want to get the issue 9, the Super President one. I want to get that hard copy, and I want to get it signed by everyone. It's just these guys don't go to shows over here that often anymore. So it's been difficult. You
and I have told this story probably on numerous episodes, so I'll keep it quick. But for anyone who's new, you and I attended San Diego Comic-Con together back in 2016. That was the year I got married, so I remember it very well. And we were exiting the convention center, and who happened to be walking in front of us? None other than Grant Morrison. And
none other.
You somehow convinced, I'm surprised I even went along with it to the extent that I did, but we just followed Morrison for a few blocks. And I just remember, I'm sure I said this to you, and I definitely was thinking it. What's the end game here? What what's the plan? And then eventually we just kind of stopped. But you know what? Now, after the journey I've had with more, I get it more. I really do.
That wasn't my first San Diego. I don't think it was yours either, but I've been to San Diego many times, and more often than not, if you're seeing a creator and they're leaving the convention center, they're usually going to a bar or restaurant. So I was kind of flying by the seat of my pants, but the way I was hoping it would work out was he was going somewhere for an after dinner drink. He didn't have an entourage around him, and maybe I could buy him a drink. That was where I was going with that. I was lucky enough to have met him the year before, but it was just a very quick question and photo op thing. I got a great selfie where he with his bald head and me with my bald head. He said we were like two hard-boiled eggs, and that has warmed my soul ever since.
That cold black soul. No, I'm just kidding. You're a wonderful guy. Question for you. You were the one who educated me that Morrison was using they, them pronouns. I noticed you've been using he, him. Has that shifted? What are we using? I just want to be consistent and respectful.
Sure. Listen, I don't know anything about anything. I just, I read a lot of articles with him, and I subscribe to his newsletter and all the other stuff. And as far as I can tell, both are acceptable. If I'm committing some terrible crime, I apologize. I'm not trying to be weird, but as far as I can tell, both are okay.
Both are okay. Fine. We will go with that.
That's how I've read it. I'm not like taking a weird stand. I think that's the case. So I've just gone back to referring to him the way I did for the first 20 years.
Listen, I've just been following your lead from the start. Ever since you told me that, it was news to me, and you told me that. I'm like, okay, fine, we'll go with that. And every guest who's been on, I'm like, when we talk about Morrison, these are the pronouns we use. So now I'll follow what you say once again.
That's what I've been saying. Again, if I am wrong, if I've misinterpreted something, I apologize. That seemed to be what he's been saying in articles and stuff. So
okay, fair enough. We have some evidence to back that up. So to answer the question I posed to you, and I guess you might be shocked given my history with this run, where historically I had not been the biggest fan. I did buy the omnibus of the entire run, which collects 0 through 18, as well as the annual. And it's a magnificent tome. And surprisingly discounted on the usual place online. If you're looking to save more than a few bucks, obviously our hearts are always with the comic shop, support your local comic shop, but it was such a steep discount that I was like, well, this is kind of worth it to have. This was one of those things. I mean, you've seen my copy of the Final Crisis softcover. It's like falling apart because with these Morrison works, you really gotta tear into them and take your time. And I just figured like this was the way to do it. And one of the things that's particularly cool about the hardcover, obviously you can do this on your own, but the hardcover rearranges a couple of issues so that the rocket ship two-parter that were released as issues 5 and 6, but were really meant to come after that initial Brainiac arc. Those are placed after the Brainiac arc in the hardcover. So you get a more fluid reading experience than you do if you were to read them on the DC app or in the original trades, where it's just like in the middle of that. It's like, what are we doing here? So I do have that, and it was a great way to read it. In the past, we've talked about the New 52 Superman generally and that publishing initiative. So I really think our focus here will be on Morrison's work on Action Comics. But I do just want to say, because I keep thinking about this, we talk a lot about those defining moments as fans. And obviously I always cite my experience with the death of Superman, but there is a much later moment with the New 52. I still remember, and I know I've talked about this, but I still remember the day that Flashpoint number 5 and Justice League number 1 released. And this was when I was working at the late great Alternate Realities, our local comic book shop. And I remember the owner had brought the shipment in and had started opening up the boxes on a Tuesday, but we were going to break everything down in full on Wednesday. And I remember that Tuesday evening, no one was there. The store was closed and the boxes were just piled up and some of them were open. And I let myself into the store and I opened up a folding chair. I found Flashpoint, I found Justice League, and I sat there and I read those two. And I just had this moment of like, I'm out. This isn't where I want to go. I can't follow where DC is going. And so I just sat out an entire era of DC and specifically of Superman. And of course I've gone back now and I've read a lot of Superman and the New 52 in particular. And I've come around in a major way. And I think this Morrison run is sort of the final piece of that puzzle. But I just kind of share this once again to say, you know, if I could go back 14 years to 2011, to my 2011 self in that empty comic shop on that folding chair, angrily reading those couple of issues, I would just say like, hey, I know this doesn't line up with your vision of the character at this point in time, but there will come a point where you can go back and you can look at this unto itself as just its own thing and its own independent, yet no less equally valid take on the character. And you're going to get a lot out of it. So it might not be the time now, but the time will come. And it's something that I hope people keep in mind. And to myself, I hope I keep that in mind as new things come out. And sometimes it's hard and we butt up against them. But to have a beautiful experience like this is really great. I feel like it's like a full circle moment here.
You know, if you had swapped out Justice League number 1 for Action Comics Volume 2 number 1, and you had gotten to the first splash page when he has a character actually say "Save me" as a reference to the Smallville song, history could be very different. You could have been like, well, this is for me. I am doubling down on this blue collar Superman. This is it. This is my guy now.
Absolutely. Now, I was thinking a lot about this run as a whole, why maybe it didn't grab me the first time around, why you've gotten some of those reactions that you were alluding to earlier. When
constantly, I get when I tell people I really like Final Crisis, they roll their eyes. They're like, "Oh yeah, you're one of those." When I tell them they like this, they're like, "Why? Like this doesn't even seem to merit the same dismissal. This seems to have just been something that either people didn't read all the way to the end or just did like immediately put down and forgot, and no one of note comes back and says, no, this is really worth reading." But I love it. I loved it at the time. Actually, this helps make me think that the New 52 was a good idea, because I think Morrison was trying to do a backdoor, like meta narrative on explaining why it was necessary, with a little bit more substantial narrative weight than, well, Flashpoint, which doesn't have any. I haven't found a lot of people who like this over the years the way they like his other works. But it's one of my favorites. It's one of my favorite Superman stories of all time, and it's one of my favorite Grant Morrison works.
Yeah, and I know as we're talking about this, the people listening are going to fall into any one of a number of categories, right? There will be those who, like ourselves, are big fans of this run. There are going to be those who maybe have not read it, or not read it in a really long time, or not read it in full, and this episode might dictate whether or not they go seek out the issues. And then I'm sure there are people who are listening to this who have experienced the run in full and are not fans, and whether we end up changing any hearts and minds or not, it's not really the objective. But if we do encourage anyone to take another look at this, I think that would be a good thing, just from my own experience as someone who did go back to it and got a lot more out of it. But I think I do now have a much better sense of the roadblocks I had before and what I think might be hurdles for other folks as well. So when you look at that initial arc, and especially the way it's laid out in the hardcover, where we excise that those rocket related issues, where we start, like you said, with this blue collar, t-shirt and jeans clad young Superman, this hearkening back to the Golden Age roots, champion of the oppressed, who's taking down corrupt businessmen, mouthing off to the police. And he's apprehended by the government. He's outed as an alien, but then Brainiac attacks. We get Brainiac in a quote unquote first Superman story, which is great. Love to see it. We get Clark donning his traditional costume, obviously updated for the New 52, utilizing those Jim Lee designs. He's able to save and enlarge the bottled city of Metropolis, and ends up using Brainiac's ship as his base, so to speak, his first fortress of solitude. He's given the keys to the city. There are seeds, of course, for what's to come later in the run. It starts, I think, on the very first panel with the little teetotaler man, who, of course, we'll have a lot more to say about. But overall, I think when you look at that first arc, Morrison is playing it as straight as I think I've ever seen Morrison play it. It could be, if I told you, oh, this was a Jeff Johns arc, or even just the way I'm describing, you'd probably be, oh, yeah, like that kind of, that feels in keeping. So I feel like Morrison plays it really straight. And I don't know if it lulls you into a little bit of a false sense of security, or it creates an expectation for what the rest of the run is going to be. But then when you get to the middle and certainly the final act of the run, what I think is really the main thrust and the main idea of what this is all about, it boils down to this imp from the fifth dimension, Vyndktvx, this enemy, this adversary of Mxyzptlk, who has set his sights on Superman and attacks Superman simultaneously across Superman's timeline. And as Vyndktvx moves in for the kill in the major, the climax of the story, time starts folding in on itself. So we get very time bendy. So we are jumping back and forth between this young, just starting out Superman and the quote unquote 5 years later Superman of the rest of the New 52 at the time. And so we're going back and forth, and we have these simultaneous attacks, and it's getting kind of time bendy, and we have visits to the fifth dimension. And so I think that's where we get Morrison being Morrison. And if you weren't expecting it, if you were reading it monthly, there are numerous places where I could see this posing a bit of a roadblock. For me, this time going into it, I knew what I was getting. And I must have just, I had read this before, but it's been a while. Maybe it was the conversation with Ralph or an article or something, but I just went in armed with the knowledge time's going to be folding in on itself. We're going to be bouncing back and forth. This villain is attacking Superman across his timeline. And with just that, it opened up a lot for me. And I was able to just go along for the ride. And I had a great time.
Yeah, I mean, that's really what you have to do. I think one of the biggest problems to enjoying Morrison's work when you know it's supposed to be connected to a larger continuity is when the rest of the continuity doesn't fit nicely like a puzzle piece that can distract some people. But, I always say he wrote this story. Let me enjoy this story. And if I can figure out how to reconcile it with other stories I like, well, then great. I'm going to give myself a no prize. But that's not the goal. The goal is I want to see what this guy wants to say in this story. And I think, I think that was kind of the point. You said he lulls you into a false sense of security. It was very important to him when someone said, do you want to write Action Comics #1? Because it's like, well, symbolically, that's one of the most important comic books of all time. Certainly the superhero genre kind of starts there. So when he had the chance, he's like, yeah, I want everyone to come on this adrenaline fueled adventure. Every aspect of it is going to be about action. art and the characterization and the pacing and all this other stuff. So he lulls you in with a very straightforward story where the Man of Tomorrow fights the City of Tomorrow in his first interaction with Lex Luthor. And yeah, as it builds up, as you meet Collector or Brainiac, as you meet all the other pieces, and then you finally realize what's going on, and that this does connect to the prior 20-25 years of continuity via the fifth dimension. It's just like, oh, okay, yeah, you got me up to speed. Now you are just we're going barreling full speed towards the cliff, but I'm ready. Let's do it. Let's see what's on the other side.
Yeah, and I would also say to any remaining skeptics out there, as someone who was one until a day or so ago, if you hadn't had that wild ride in this run, if it had just been that initial arc and then Morrison left, or if Morrison did the 18 or 19 with the zero issue and played it quote unquote straight throughout, I don't know if we'd still be talking about it. Maybe not. I mean, it's Morrison, so we probably would, but I don't know if there would be as much meat on the bone. And also it's like, would you feel like you really had the Grant Morrison experience if it was just 19 issues of Superman calling the police rats and holding up corrupt businessmen over his head? I mean, I would love it. It would be a lot of fun, but this is what makes it a Morrison piece, I feel.
Yeah, well, I think if you get to the end of it, I think you see why the first part makes a lot of sense, because it's a response. You know, when final when Flashpoint happens in 2010, 2011, we've gotten an incredibly like mature, paternal Superman. He's married, he's with Lois, he's a brand, he's all of these things. He's great. In a lot of ways, he's at the end. So when the New 52 gives the opportunity to introduce you to a new version of the character, the story goes out of its way towards the end to kind of justify this and say, well, we're going back to the beginning to show you what he's like stripped back to the way he was in the beginning. And that's not arbitrary. That's not us just wanting to do this. There's a narrative reason here. And the narrative says, well, when you take away everything that he earned over those decades since the last crisis, you're left with that raw, original, and this comes really into focus when we do the Super Doom story. It's like you're left with what happens before the corporatization, and that's the genes Superman. That's the blue collar Superman. The Morrison described him as the Bruce Springsteen Superman, and I love that, because it's like you strip away everything else and you're still left with this incredible thing that's not going to stop protecting people. That's the only reason he does it. And then when you get to the end, and he turns to Vyndktvx and says, "You're attacking me from all of these different points, but to you it's the same point, which means you're exhausted. I'm not. I'm going to use what I've learned to bring it at you." And it starts there. It starts with him, protecting people on that train. It's a beautiful poem almost.
Beautifully said. And it's like, it gives the character an arc over these 19 issues. And I know that was important to Morrison. That came up in some exit interviews that I read. Mm-hmm. And even the back matter in the omnibus, there are quotes from Morrison and from his primary artistic contributor, Rags Morales. And they talked a lot about really wanting the book to live up to its title, and really leaning to this, what they call muscular action. And Morrison talked about how, we wanted to put him up against a wrecking ball, a train, like these big physical objects to live up to the title. And I think they did that. Now, the fact you mentioned before that we had a relaunch in the New 52, not just of the line as a whole, but specifically Action Comics and Detective Comics. I mean, this was a huge deal. I mean, there've only been 2 times where someone has written an Action Comics #1, and this is one of them. Do you look at that and say that was too far? They should have left Action Comics alone, or do you feel like, no, if we're really going to do this relaunch and commit to it, like, you got to go all in?
No, I'm happy they did it. I mean, in a lot of ways, they probably should have done it after the original Crisis on Infinite Earths, because it's like, when I started reading comics in 91, I was like, Action Comics 700, 600. It's like, what is this? I mean, not that Spider-Man was all that much better in the 400s across the street, but still, it's like, I don't know. If you had told me, like, Action Comics 40 or whatever, maybe I'm more likely to pick it up. Certainly, Superman dies in volume 2, number 75. And if that had been the main title of the time, I'd have been like, oh, all right, maybe I've only been reading this guy a couple of years. That's okay. But no, I liked And I see a lot of things. The new 52 failed. The new 52 failed, and it's like, well, it didn't fail. You just didn't understand its what it was trying to accomplish. What it was trying to accomplish was to get people to talk about it, and that happened. Was every book in the line a successful? No, but you don't launch 52 titles because you think you're going to have 52 wins. You launch 52 titles because you're hoping to have a couple of wins, and the company's still publishing today. So, I mean, obviously, it didn't take them down with it. But no, I'm very happy that they committed to it. Actually, I was happy for the entire line. For a while there was a redesign of Wonder Woman floating around where they let, I think it was Cliff Chang, like really redesign her. They gave her pants and everything else, and I was really excited to get that. And then by the time it came out, she looked very similar to how she looks now, and I was just like, I don't know, whatever. But with Superman, it was like, no, you really you threw everything out, and you really built from the ground up. I really feel like I'm getting on board for something important. And then, I mean, yeah, when he has that final battle with when Vyndktvx, and you realize like this was all part of the plan. It's just it makes the whole thing seem more rewarding. Like you really are on board for something special.
I agree. And also, I have to say, I go on a little bit of a rant here. We spent a lot of time last year in our Red Skies event looking at all of these crises, and audience members might recall my ever-growing frustration with the never-ending cosmic machinations and reveals. And I don't object to Action Comics, but at the same time, it's like, whoa, we're inserting yet another player in this, right? So we talked about Vyndktvx attacking Superman across his timeline. Maybe the attack that stands out the most is him being responsible for the car crash that kills Jonathan and Martha Kent in the New 52. Then, of course, we get into Doomsday Clock and we learn the role that Dr. Manhattan plays in everything. And then we move further into our metal events and Dark Crisis. And to be perfectly honest, I've already forgotten a bunch of the players in those, which maybe says something, but we have further hands kind of stirring the pot. So
Yeah.
it's one of the, but again, that's looking at the larger picture. I think in the context of this, what's funny, this, the audience knows this, I'm not the biggest fan at all of Superman versus magic.
Okay.
And even a character like Mxyzptlk, in certain instances, I think he works really well. I really enjoyed him in Superman the Animated Series, for example. And when he pops in here and there, and we have kind of a fun one-off, it's fine. It doesn't necessarily light my fire. Generally not a huge fan of the magic-centered stories. So you might be surprised that I got as much mileage as I did out of Vyndktvx and this whole reveal. But I think the reason why it worked for me, first of all, it wasn't played for laughs. I mean, this is not Mxyzptlk who's looking to play a prank, right? This is intense and severe. This vendetta that this imp is carrying out. But I guess when we look at Superman himself, this mythological icon, the idea of Superman is so powerful. So the notion that there is an enemy that's going to attack throughout his timeline, in effect, attack the idea of what Superman is, I think it's perfectly in line with what you would hope for an antagonist. And I also do appreciate the fact that not just with Vyndktvx, but some of the others as well, maybe I didn't get as much mileage out of some of the others, the new adversaries introduced. But still, the fact that while we have Luthor, for example, in the first arc, and we have Brainiac and we have Metallo, again, playing it real straight in that first arc, and you read that first one, and you're like, oh, okay, like we're going to spend a lot of time with these characters. Nope, they're mostly off the board after that.
Yeah.
But the fact that there was this attempt to populate these stories with some new antagonists, great.
Yeah.
I think that's commendable.
No, I agree. So a couple of things. Yeah, I long ago learned that other creators aren't going to take what he puts down and use it in the best ways. I mean, over across the street for X-Men, I've read that arc 100 times, and it's very obvious to me now, as a jaded adult, that Cassandra Nova becomes the character of Ernst, and Zorn is Magneto, and there's a period at the end of both of those sentences. But if you read the X-Men books that came out immediately after, those are not the case, whether people misunderstood what was going on or just, willingly wanted to disregard them, which is fine. This is a living thing. It's the eternal second act structure of superhero comics. Someone's always going to change something, but I know what I enjoy most. And it's the same thing here. It's like, yeah, you can put Dr. Manhattan into a Superman story, which of course defeats the purpose of Watchmen. But yeah, to me, it's like, no, an evil imp attacked him, and as a result, he undid the DC universe. And if you want to fix that later, fine, have another crisis event. This wasn't the first one you had. It's certainly not going to be the last one. And the DC universe is littered with stuff like that, where Morrison wanted to try to do another thing and it didn't quite work out, which is fine. He knew what he was getting into. But yeah, it's funny. This is going to sound ridiculous. I never think of the fifth dimensional imps as magic characters. They are, of course, but going back to the golden age, Jerry Siegel was very much like he loved practical jokes. He loved practical joke characters, right? You had Toy Man and Prankster and Mr. Mix and another character he created later called Funny Man. Like, this was something he was really interested in. So I always liked the idea that as Superman got stronger, there was always a character who was more powerful than him who represented imagination. Morrison's got on record as saying that, in his view of things, what the fifth dimension means is it's just imagination. The imps of the fifth dimension can do anything the reader or writer can imagine. That's how to explain their powers in the simplest way. So the idea is that anything Vyndktvx can think that will hurt Superman, he can do. And over the course of this story, you see how vicious and awful he can really be. And what I love about this Superman in particular is he keeps just picking himself up and is like, if there's a way that I can save people and continue to inspire other people to do the same thing, I'm going to, even though I've suffered this horrible fate, because that's what I am fundamentally. That's what I am as an idea. So it just continues to land with me all these years later.
Dude, totally. I mean, there's a line that he has when he's on Mars trying to rescue the astronauts out there. And he says, when the odds are impossible, do the impossible. And you were mentioning this before when we get that final battle between Superman and Vyndktvx. By the way, I love the smile that you have. I feel like there's just a sense of satisfaction that, like, I've come all the way over on this run. But when he's battling Vyndktvx, and like you said, he points out, like, to Vyndktvx, this is all happening at once. But for Superman, he's been experiencing these sequentially. He knows he wins every time, right? So that aspect, and just the fact that he says, I won't ever stop. And this is something that's repeated, a number of times, that there's always a way. There's something so primal about this version. I want to talk more about this whole champion of the oppressed angle, but I mentioned before the art side of things. So Rags Morales and Brad Walker are our primary pencilers. We have Gene Ha, who does a number of the Krypton sequences in the early issues. And I believe did the designs as well for the series, for the Krypton piece. And Andy Kubert does those 2 issues with the Rocket Song issue, where we kind of get the origin story from the perspective of the rocket ship. And then the following issue where Vyndktvx's, what a mouthful, anti-Superman army steals the core, the kryptonite engine core from the rocket, and the Legion of Superheroes and Superman have to retrieve it. I'll just say real quick about that. It had one of the most, remember when we talked about the new X-Men run a while back and we talked like Liquid Time, and it's like, what is this? In this issue that I'm referring to here in Action, there's this bit about a teleport rifle firing a miniature lead bullet into Superman's brain that contains a tesseract. And that's where the anti-Superman army's hiding. And it's just one of those things, like, you just gotta go along for the ride on this. Like, you just have to have fun with this.
Yeah, you do. You have to. Yeah.
I do have to say, I think actually one of our patron questions gets at this, but I'll address it now. I do think the run as a whole, I wish that we could have had one artist doing the entire thing, or at least, separating it by arcs if we're not going to have one artist. I love Rags. Been a big fan of his from Identity Crisis and Hawkman. I love that. Oh yeah, okay. I love Identity Crisis and that Hawkman run. I still have not read his Hour Man series with Tom Peyer from the 1 million hour. Have you ever read that?
Oh yeah. Because first of all, I love Tom Peyer, and second of all, Hour Man is another Grant Morrison creation. So yeah, I read that back in the day.
So that's always been on my list. But so I love Rags and his stuff, but I think, maybe deadlines got the better of him. We also know that with New 52, a lot happened. This kind of came together very quickly. I don't get the sense that there was much lead time. That is one of those things, like when we look back at All-Star Superman, for example, I mean, it took years for those 12 issues to come out, which was frustrating at the time. But now you have that single volume all drawn by Frank Quitely, and that lives forever. Not that this doesn't, but
I know
there's,
what you mean.
there's just a visual cohesiveness to that. That's not, it's not like it's totally absent here, but yeah, I just wish that we had been able to have that. That's all.
Well, it's funny too. I agree completely, but it's like his Batman run where every year I think he would get with his editor and they'd basically be like, it was the highest selling book of the year. Do you have another year in you? He'd be like, yeah, sure, let's do it. And then artists would come and go because that's the nature of an ongoing storyline, right? Like I don't know everyone who drew the first year of the original Action Comics, if it was all Schuster, if it was someone else, but it's this idea of like if it has to come out every week or every month, sometimes things have to give. So I kind of like the idea that this story lived in real time. Like, yeah, it would have been nice if someone had said, okay, you and the artist of your Chris Burnham or whomever, you guys are going to get a set 12 to 18 issues, tell whatever you want, and then Perez is coming on or whatever. But they didn't do that. They were like, nah, go do whatever you're going to do and what have you. And I think the end result is something that's amazing. But yeah, I agree. It's not prestige format. It's almost like dirty, like monthly comics. Like things have to be worked in. Other storylines have to be factored in. It's aggressive. It's action. It's a nice counterpoint to All-Star, which exists in a perfect scientific vacuum and can be given to anyone and can be adapted and can be read in the highest literary arts. This is almost disposable. It's great. It's like the Daily Planet itself. It's like you have to consume it when it comes out. And if you go back later on, you'll kind of have to remember the context in which it came out. It's real ongoing comics.
Oh, all right. I like that way of looking at it. Now let's circle back to this whole t-shirt and jeans iteration of the character, because I love this. And I think it's fair to say that cover to Action 1 in particular from volume 2 is iconic in its own right, of him in the blue t-shirt and jeans and the little red cape and essentially running it seems through the streets of Metropolis. And it's so dynamic. And just the fact that we lean in to those golden age origins where he was knocking around wife beaters and tearing down tenements that weren't up to code. The fact that he has this social conscience, to be honest, how do I put this? I would love to see more of it. Part of me is surprised we don't see more of it, yet at the same time, unfortunately, I think I understand why. But the notion of people in power abusing that power, not looking out for the people they're supposed to be. And here comes this figure who has the means to stand up to them on behalf of other people. It's so powerful. It's timeless, but there are times in our history where I feel like it's particularly relevant. And I would argue now is one of those times. Yet at the same time, I feel like if you were to do stories like this now, what would the charge be against it? It's woke. DC's what? Something along those lines. It's funny. Spoiler for upcoming episode. We're gonna do a really great episode on President Luthor a little bit down the line. And I've already been thinking about this, and I'm like, all right, obviously the parallels to what we're living through are obvious. I can't ignore it. Yet this is not a political show. I've been thinking about what I've been workshopping a little spiel that I'm going to do, but wasn't really expecting to talk about it here. But I had that thought as I was reading. It's like, why don't we get more of this? Yet again, at the same time, I think that might be why we don't. I don't know.
I mean, I think there's two answers to that. The first is, narratively speaking, the more powerful Superman gets, the less you can pull things like this off. Because if you get the Superman of the height of the Silver Age, or even to the late 90s, 2000, you can't do stories like this because there's no power in the world that could stop him. If he was still that version that said, listen, I'm working class and I'm going to make sure the system works the same for everyone. That is fundamentally, I believe this. I've never spoken to anyone who knew the man, but I really do believe that Siegel and Schuster were like, superpower needs to act to level the playing field. And this great American system that we've all designed is going to work the same for everyone. It doesn't matter how much money you have or how much capital you have. Superpower is the leveling agent. These claims that Superman or Batman or the superhero concept is fascist omits a very key thing, which was created by people who worked for a living, and it was used originally to level that playing field, which is great to do when Superman is leaping tall buildings, and he's got a lot of obvious weakness. But when it's the Superman who can move the moon and everything else, it's kind of more difficult to do that because eventually he's just going to have to take everything over, and you don't want to tell those stories. And then the other side of it, of course, is the recovering capitalist in me goes back to the Super Doom story, where like Superman is one of the most marketable intellectual properties that has ever existed, and you only get so much mileage out of him being like, "Oh man, you're a billionaire who abuses his wealth. Well, I'm throwing you into the river, and if you come back out and do this again, I'm gonna throw you back in the river." It's like, no, man, Discovery Warner has shareholders, and they're holding on for dear life as it is. So, I go back to that Super Doom story where, when he is facing down corporate Superman, the Superman of Earth Doomsday, that's him fighting, the version of him that says you can't help people, you can't help your creators, you can't help people who find themselves in that situation. And yeah, it's arguable that worldwide there's just as many of them now as there were at the height of the Great Depression. So I'm with you, and I think that's why this story is so important, to remind you, like, no, man, Superman has become one thing, but he started out as something very different. You could probably create that character today and everyone would be like, oh, cool, he's a supervillain or an anti-hero or something, and be like, no, that's Golden Age Superman right there.
Yeah, look, I'm not purposely trying to rile people up, but in recent years we've had this shift from truth, justice, and the American way to truth, justice, and a better tomorrow. And I know there are folks who yearn for the prior version, and I think one of the arguments is often like, well, we've had that for so long. It's like, sure, you haven't had it from the beginning, though, right? And if the argument is really sort of this creator's intent, then this golden age version, which is brought to life anew by Morrison, is really it. But I love it. There's something just so visceral and so satisfying about this more stripped down, socially conscious Superman right from those. I mean, if you're going to relaunch Action Comics and you're going to quote unquote reboot Superman, I feel like these first few pages when he lands in the t-shirt and jeans and little red cape. By the way, our mutual friend Rich Roney, for 14 years, every time we've talked about the New 52, he always says the Lil Abner cape. I still don't really know who or what Lil Abner is. I mean, kind of.
Me neither. I have no idea what he means when he says that.
And I looked it up, and I didn't see the cape he was talking about. Someone listening is like, oh, I know exactly what he's talking about, and they'll send it to me, and I thank you. But for all these years, I was like, Lil Abner. I'm like, all right. Anyway, but when he lands on the balcony of Glenn Morgan, a.k.a. Mr. Metropolis's place, and he hoists him up. But even before that, when he lands and he sniffs, he goes, rats with money, right? And he holds him up and he forces this guy to confess to using cheap labor and bribing officials and using substandard materials and whatever the case may be. When he mouths off to the police and basically says, like, if you did your job, I wouldn't have to do it for you. We find out through, I think it's an exchange with his landlady, who of course ends up being the bride of Mixius Pitalik in human form, about a wife beater who Superman off panel threw to the river and like broke his legs, and he ends up becoming Kryptonite Man. We get that backstory in the annual, but that version of the character is just something so satisfying. But hand in hand with that, I think why this works so well for me is that, for one thing, it's not just Superman. Clark is a crusading reporter in this, working for the Daily Star, once again hearkening back to the original. We get this great backstory about how George Taylor had been covering a story in Smallville back in the day and met the Kents and met Clark as a young kid. And that gives him the foot in the door when he first gets to the big city, which I thought was a nice little touch and connection point. But the fact that Clark is this crusading reporter and he's digging up all this dirt on Glenn Morgan. And then, yes, eventually Superman needs to intervene. But the fact that Clark is doing all of this stuff and people are coming after him and the police are tossing his little room in the boarding house where he's staying. I love all of that. And one of the big things I wanted to ask you, I mean, I think I know what your answer is going to be, but do you look at All-Star, 1 Million, maybe even JLA and this action run as Morrison writing the same Superman? Not in a literal strict continuity sense, but like in a spiritual sense. Like, is this kind of one mega arc when we take all of these works together? Do you see it that way?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you can. I mean, certainly in the case of All Star and 1 Million, they have a
Yes.
point that crosses over very very specifically. But yeah, I mean, again, I would also say, this comes later than most of those other works, and then when you factor in the Vyndktvx, this could literally be a continuation of that. But I do think I think spiritually, yeah, I think there was a very conscious effort to go back to the beginning and say, well, now wait a second, what haven't we touched on? What haven't we seen a while? And it's this idea that we're talking about, that, like, Superman, he fought four people. Like, one of the issues here that I think speaks to this the best is when they go into the factory of tomorrow, and it's all automated, and they talk about how, again, this is incredibly relevant. It's like people were being let go because automation got good, or whatever, and he's like, you can't let all these people off. This place isn't making anything anyone needs, and it's him versus mechanization, which is like, if you go back to the Fleischer cartoons, he was constantly fighting robots and mecha and everything else, because, like, you go back in the day, and it's like people were seeing their jobs and their livelihood and everything they were trained for take away, so that people could save money and do everything else. And obviously we're distilling a very complex sociological movement down to things that'll fit in a children's comic book, but that's how a lot of people meet it, so it's worth mentioning. But yeah, I like that every aspect of Superman in Action Comics Volume 2 is dedicated towards this cause. Clark, Superman, everything in between. Even when Clark is taken off the board, he goes and he becomes a firefighter, and he adopts a new name and does everything else, because the idea is that everything he does is about helping people, because that is what he believes his purpose is. And that's where he is finding his purpose. And I think that's so great, because even as his strength grows and his connection to other people grow and he meets more people, it's always with this focus of, like, awesome, there's more of us, we're stronger, we're smarter. What are we doing now? What can we fix? I have a giant spaceship full of alien cultures in orbit around Earth. How can we use this to make things better? How can we help as many people possible and have fun while we're doing it? I just think, like, I'm sold. Give me more of this guy. Give me a book featuring this guy now.
100%. And kind of what I had in mind with that question about this kind of mega arc sort of thing, to me, the biggest connection point or bridge to All-Star is Pa Kent, because in All-Star, when Clark is giving that eulogy, he talks about how his father taught him that the strong have to stand up for the weak, and bullies don't like it when you push back. And there are moments here, particularly in those backup stories written by Shali Fish, but also in some of the lead stories as well, where you really see the influence that the Kents, and Jonathan in particular, had on forming Clark's worldview. And I like that, because, of course, I love anything to do with the Kents, but also, I've talked about this many times, I like for the Kents to be alive for all the reasons we've talked about. However, I'm open-minded, and I look at a run like this and I say to myself, well, they were not physically alive in Clark's adulthood. They were very much a presence in the stories, through the flashbacks, through those backup stories. And you see the ways in which their values were imprinted upon Clark, and how he's putting them into action in the present day. But also, going back to the word you used before about unrestrained, there is something to be said for, and I know it's crazy for me to make this argument, but there's something to be said for a Clark whose parents have passed. It's like he doesn't have to go home and answer to them. And I think that somewhat allows for a more unbridled Clark and Superman, because there is nothing, not that the Kents tie him down or hold him back, but he's just out there. Now, I'll slightly argue against myself, because one of the things that so stood out to me upon reread was I don't even know what the word is, a rabble rouser? I don't know that that's the right word, but Pa Kent had a I don't even know how you would describe it, but not just that he was socially conscious, but one of the backup stories, there's an exchange between Pa and Clark where Pa is complaining about the fact that one of their neighbors, their tractor was repossessed, like right before harvesting season. And we learn through the dialogue that Pa had Clark put the tractor on top of the bank. Right. And then there's another instance in one of the lead stories, the one with the Legion of Superheroes, when they visit Clark as an adolescent. And Clark and Pa have retrieved a neighbor's bull that that got out. And Pa wants to teach the bull's owner a lesson. So he's like, let's leave the sleeping bull by the side of the road with a bunch of empty beer cans to teach this guy a lesson. And so when the Legion find Clark, he's using his heat vision to pop open all these cans of beer. So it's like Pa is putting him up to this stuff. So that's why I say I argue against myself a little bit, because I feel like Pa would be like 1000% on board with like everything Clark does in these stories.
I do too, but it's a question of scale, right? Like,
Yes.
Jonathan's great, but Jonathan can only teach from what he knows. And, Jonathan is like, especially back in the day, like Jonathan is like an old school, like Woody Guthrie farmer type person. Like, he knows how tough his life is, and for those of his neighbors and those of his family. Like, this is a guy who's like, no, we got to look out for as many people as we can with what we have, and he instills that in his son, and the result is that his son takes it incredibly serious. But his son is also fighting gods and finds that he's descended from a race of people who every single item on their world was indestructible, which is something that I really enjoy, and I really appreciate about the costume that Clark gets later on. But I agree. I love that John is willing to do all this stuff, because it also, like, it gives him a sense of humor, Like, another thing I liked about Golden Age Superman, and I mentioned this before when I was talking about Jerry Siegel, and I'm sure Joe Shuster as well, their proclivity for doing like funny characters is like, the original Superman was like a trickster deity. He didn't just do vengeance and revenge. He had fun with it. It's like, you got to find your fun where you can. And I feel like the same thing is here. Like, Jonathan's like, put it on the bank, do this, do that, teach these people a lesson. Like, come on, we gotta make this work as quickly as possible. And Clark carries that to his adult life, where he's always got a little grin on his face, where he's like, you can't hurt me. You can't hurt anyone I care about. I'm going to keep doing this. I might as well make you remember why I'm doing it in the first place. So I loved it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that messaging from Jonathan that no one can do what you do. You have to help people. Right? People are going to abuse their power. You have to stand up for those who can. And people know this, right? When we look at the Smallville iteration, we look at the Man of Steel iteration, the more cautious version of Jonathan Kent, who doesn't want his son to be taken away, who's not necessarily saying, hey, you got to get out there and do this. I identify with that version. That version resonates with me as well. But there is also something to be said for this kind of take on the character, where it's, so rooted in those Midwestern values of like, no, you stand up to these bullies, and it's like, you can do stuff that other people can't do. And I actually want to jump to one of our patron questions. We have more that we'll circle to later, but our pal Brian Dempsey says, hot take, right after we did our big, hot takes episode. By the way, to everyone who submitted in that, and to all the people who've listened, we got such great feedback. It was really a ton of fun. But Brian said, here's a hot take. I like Sholly Fish's backup stories more than Morrison's main story in almost every issue. Turns out the moments that stuck with me over a decade after my first read are his backups. He really fleshes things out, like Crypto's story in the Zone, or the planet staff grieving Clark Kent when it appears he's been killed, or what's going on in Metropolis with Steel while Superman is fighting Brainiac. I could go on. What do you think of the backups, and do you have a favorite of those? So while that marinates for you, let me just say, I don't go quite that far, right? I enjoy the main stories primarily, but I love the backup stories as well. And I do get what Brian is saying. I feel like even for myself, things that, especially those moments with Pa that I've sort of always remembered from prior readings, they're from the backups. One of the ones that I really love is the one where Clark is taking his last walk through the house before he leaves, and Lana and Pete, Justice for Pete Ross, Lana and Pete are there. And there's this great, it's a very melancholy, bittersweet moment, but there's a great little nod to the pre-crisis Superboy continuity. Pete has this line about, oh, Lana, said no to my idea about getting you a giant goodbye cake that everyone in the town can eat. On that note, and then I want to come back to the backup stories, but on that note, there are a ton of great Easter eggs throughout here. That's one. There's an exchange between Jonathan and Martha, again, in one of the backups, I believe, where they're talking about the cost of in vitro and then the cost of adoption. And Jonathan's like, well, if we lose everything, like we'll just, move into town and open a general store. Again, not to the pre-crisis. Look, this is where I land on little tidbits like that. If I'm not enjoying the story, those don't win me over. But if I'm enjoying the story, I can appreciate them. So those are ones that I appreciated. But the one that I was like, oh, that's such a deep cut. on the marquee of the movie theater in one of the scenes in Metropolis, I think, one of the stars of the movie is Gregory Reed. Does this ring any bells?
It does not.
This is such a deep cut. But I'm like, oh man, like that's the thing. There's so much love crafted, in crafting all these stories. So Gregory Reed was a character in the comics in the Bronze Age who was essentially George Reeves. It was like an actor in the fictional world of the DC universe who played Superman. And that's it. I mean, it's been decades since, been done, but to see that there, I was like, oh man, like that was such a great touch. So I love that. But let me toss it to you, just kind of on the backup stories. And were there any in particular that you really loved?
I love the backup stories. I'm always happy that they're included in the collected editions. They're great. I wish there was more from Charlie Fish. I think he's a great writer. I don't like the Morrison ones, but I think I understand what the question is saying, because you do remember them because they have the luxury of being completely self-contained, right? Charlie didn't have to explain fifth dimensional idea space and all this other stuff. He could focus on the awesome little moments that need to be unpacked, but maybe Morrison didn't have, the ability to slow down enough to do. So I think they work perfectly in tandem, and I wouldn't want to, as far as I'm concerned, they're part of the story. You need them. You absolutely have to have them. My favorite one is the one about the t-shirt vendor. I've gone back to read that one just because I'll be sitting there and I'll be like, Morrison write that one or did Charlie? I'm not sure. And I just go back and I'll just flip through it. I love that one. It's such a New York thing. You go down every street corner and there's a tchotchke store with I love New York crap. And I love the idea that in the city of tomorrow, there's one on every street. Now Superman gets his shirts. I'll get you any color you want, whatever denomination. He gets them here. And Clark is like, yeah, sure. All of them. I got them all. Every single one of them is telling you the truth, as long as they don't overcharge you. That's fine. I'm not copywriting it or anything like that. Go to town. Shop from everyone. I love that so much.
That was great. On that note, I would love to see the t-shirt and jeans look. And yes, I know in Smallville he wore a blue t-shirt, but I mean, the look that we get here in this comic, I would love to see this on screen. I would love, I know we're not getting an origin story in Jimothy Gunn's, new iteration here, but if we got a flashback or something and you got to see him in that, I would love it. I would love it.
Did you say Jimothy?
Yeah, from The Office,
Oh, sorry. I've never seen The Office.
James Gunn, but occasionally I'll call him Jimothy. We'll see how much I like the movie and then whether he's James or Jimothy in my eyes. But anyway. But I love the look. I would love to see that represented. My God, I would love a pop of that. I would proudly put that on the shelf behind me. Funko Pop of the New 52 look.
I am avidly waiting for McFarlane Toys to give me an action figure of that. I mean, he's made some good ones that I really want to get a hold of, but that one, that's a pre-order. If I see that pop up on his Instagram feed, that's a pre-order, no questions asked.
That would be awesome. One other one a backup story that I have to cite, which is, I believe, the penultimate one, where Clark is bouncing through time as time is unfolding. And so we're in Smallville on the night of Clark's prom, which is the night that Jonathan and Martha will meet their end. And high school Clark is replaced with present day Superman. And he has this conversation with Jonathan, and Clark is like, there's so much I want to tell you guys. And Jonathan immediately picks up on it. He's like, well, the fact that you want to tell us this leads me to believe we're not around. And he's like, yeah. And I tear up as I say this, but Jonathan's response of just like, he's totally fine. He's totally fine with it. He's like, well, I never expected to live forever. He's like, just tell me two things. Are you happy? Are you helping people? It's like that. Like, that's the thing. Like, if your son, your daughter, your child, like if your child is okay, like that's it. That's what, and I just kind of love that. That peace, that awareness, and those questions, like, because that's ultimately, are you happy? And for Jonathan in particular, all the conversations they had about using your power to help people. Yeah. And even in the main stories, right, we see glimpses of the car crash and the aftermath. We see, I feel like maybe Morrison had this in mind the whole time, or they had to I feel like they had to smooth this out, because we get to a point in one of the final issues where we've had the car accident. Jonathan's in the hospital bed and he's like, I want to die at home. And then Clark, because there was an earlier scene in one of the original issues where, Clark is at Jonathan's bedside. So I feel like maybe they had to smooth that out a little bit. Yeah. But still, like, this deathbed thing, going back to our golden age comics, right? Of You have to promise me. And he literally says that you'll be a champion for the downtrodden and the oppressed. So his deathbed wish, but that backup story where they have that moment, oh man, that got me. So beautiful.
It's great. There's no better response you could have than, are you happy? Are you helping people? Yes. Well, then what's going to happen is going to happen. Well, I accomplished everything I wanted to do here. You're here. You're fine. That's that. It's like you're, you're doing it. You're absolutely doing it. And I just, there's a reason that every version has the Kents, or at the very least, Jonathan. Like, even if he's, terrible Zack Snyder Jonathan, he's still there. He's still a very key component of the story.
Every effing time. God damn it, man.
You said the other day that you agreed with that tornado scene. That thing keeps me awake at night.
No, we've talked about it recently. That's fine. Anyway. One of our audience members, you know who you are. Someone reached out to me and was like, I appreciate how you bite your tongue every time someone brings this up, because we've talked about it. Anyway, going back to the Clark side of all of this, and Clark as this crusading reporter, the Daily Planet side of it is great. I don't know that we've ever had a better Clark Jimmy dynamic than here. I honestly, like, they're just peers and they're pals, like legit pals, Clark and Jimmy. It's not little kid kind of looking up to him. I mean, they're just buddies. Clark crashes at Jimmy's place for months. We see that. I think that's in that Zero issue where we flash back to the early days before Action Comics #1. But I don't know. I don't know what else to say. It's just like, this is the dynamic. I feel like we're always a little bit off from this, but just make them contemporaries.
Yeah. I mean, listen, once you get away from the golden age where Jimmy's pretty much his own character and he can pull his own stuff, and you have to have a way to have their relationship. And it's like, well, they're friends. They're just friends. Like, doesn't need to be, a weird thing. It doesn't make sense that Superman's sidekick would be this guy with no powers if again, he can like move the sun. But, if they're just friends in their day-to-day life, if they hang out, if they're similar in age, again, if he is allowed to be what Pete Ross was to Superboy, then that's the relationship. Characters need people to talk to, and that's what Jimmy is supposed to be. So, I agree. You see it across the street in Spider-Man. He's always got to have someone to complain to, right? The movies had it with the character of Ned too. It's like Jimmy fills that role perfectly. It's like, man, I had a long day, and it's like, well, he's talking about fighting Lex Luthor or Brainiac, but he's complaining about something else, and Jimmy's like, yeah, that's crazy. Listen, you want to get on the Xbox? Like, you need that. It humanizes him, and I've been a fan of Jimmy Olsen for a very long time, but this one in particular is one of my favorites.
Yeah, man, absolutely. On this note, though, of having someone to talk to, not to harp on the Kents, whether they should live or die aspect, but one thing though, I did come around on this where Mrs. Nixley, the landlady, the imp in disguise, right? She pretty early. I mean, of course, we learn there's a lot more going on with her, but very early on, she reveals to Clark that she knows who he is. And so they're able to have the kind of frank conversations that you would typically see when Clark flies back home to the farm. And I just can't help but say to myself, well, is the landlady is there not an argument here that it's like, well, this is why you want the Kents to be around. Like, he needs someone to talk to.
Oh, yeah.
And if they're not there, you have to then create somebody else. So I do feel like ultimately it probably shows why it's helpful to have the Kents there. But in this particular story, I think that character and the role she filled, and certainly the larger purpose that she would have, made sense.
You're 100% right. And if you don't have Martha, then he needs a Martha. And in this case, it was Mrs. Nixley. But there are other examples of this. Like when the Supergirl show started on whatever channel it started on, they famously had, Jimmy Olsen as James Olsen. And he was this big, respectable guy. And it's like, the super person needs a nerd to talk to. So they had to introduce the character of Win. It's like, there's a reason that these narrative relationships have survived decades. If you're going to change something, you have to change something else to adapt it. So I agree. I think the landlady is a perfect example of why you really need Martha, because at the end of the day, Clark needs someone to talk to who knows both sides of him 100%. He needs someone to talk to, and Martha or the landlady make a hell of a lot more sense than talking to his AI dad. So I think you absolutely need that, because if he doesn't have that sounding block to talk to, he's gonna the tether to his humanity is going to begin to fray, right? Until he lets Lois in on the secret, which is usually later on. But yeah, no, I agree 100%. The landlady is clearly a stand-in for Martha. And this is what I was talking about before, where the more Vyndktvx tries to break things down, the more, you know, reality kind of stitches it back together and says, no, you need someone to talk to, and we got to hide, Mr. Mix's wife somewhere in here. She's going to watch over you because you need that, and you deserve it. You're helping everyone. You certainly help the other people in the building. So no, I think you're 100% right.
I like that. At the time, man, all I saw in this run was what was taken away. His maturity, his experience, his relationship with Lois, the Kents. Like, I just saw what was gone. But when you strip the character down and then you see those kind of core qualities at play and you build him back up and you take him on this journey, it's really great. I guess I wish I'd been more open to it at the time, but I'm glad I'm open to it now.
Hey man, you were in the majority. The second this run ended, they brought back post-crisis Superman with his wife and kid. And as far as I know, there's still the main characters today. God only knows what happened to young Lois. So,
oh, have you not read Superman Reborn?
No, nothing. I've read nothing.
Oh, well, that's a whole thing where I won't get too deep in the weeds on that, but that was a rebirth era story that crossed over between Superman and Action Comics, written by Tomasi and Jurgens, where we merged the rebirth / post-crisis, Jesus Christ, the rebirth / post-crisis and New 52 versions of the characters were merged. And it was like red energy and blue energy. So like you see at the end of this run where you got like Superman red, Superman blue, they kind of played on that idea. And Mxyzptlk was involved. And anyway, it kind of consolidated the histories and the lives of the New 52 and the rebirth.
Okay.
This podcast is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP to save 10% on your order. That's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions. It helps support the show too. Thank you. We all love the big budget superhero films, but the world of independent cinema remains a place of unbridled creative freedom and entrepreneurial spirit. Whether you're an independent filmmaker yourself or you just love movies, don't miss these New Jersey film festivals. Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, and Round Reel in Bloomfield. Submission information for filmmakers can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news about events, discounts, tickets, and much more. Aw Yeah Comics celebrates everything that is wonderful about comics, toys, artwork, and the joy they bring to people. Visit them in person at one of their 3 locations, Harrison, New York, Muncie, Indiana, or Skokie, Illinois, home to our pal, Sweet Sweet Bernie. If you have children and have been looking for a family-friendly store, look no further. Join Aw Yeah for exciting events, including creator signings, how-tos, and more. Visit awyeahcomics.com and follow them on social media. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Say it with me now. Aw yeah. But going back to the landlady, there's a great exchange towards the end of that first arc where Clark isn't sure if she's going to out him or what her agenda is. And he says to her, he's like, if you reveal my identity, essentially, like Clark Kent will just disappear, right? And someone else will show up someplace else. And then you see that play out in the next main arc where we don't get this spelled out for us before it happens, but then we sort of learn a little bit more of Clark's motivations after when he articulates them to Batman. But essentially, he feels like he's outgrown the Clark Kent persona, that it no longer serves a purpose. And I guess this is informed. He feels like he's completed his work at the Star in terms of exposing these corrupt businessmen. He is very conflicted about taking Perry White's job offer to come over to the Daily Planet. He feels like it would be a betrayal of George Taylor. Batman clearly has sussed out that Superman is actually Clark Kent. And that, by the way, I love that scene with the young Superman and the budding Justice League meeting in like an abandoned warehouse or whatever. And Superman trying to get them to do something about poverty in another part of the world or something to that effect. And no one biting. But I just kind of loved he's kind of trying to do something here. So just this idea once again reinforced, I thought was great.
Yeah, no, I thought it was really consistent because, the Golden Age Superman wasn't around by the time the Justice League came around. He was barely around. He's quote unquote part of the early Justice Society, but not really. No one thinks of him that way. But even before the Justice Society was created, there's a great story they did where he goes and he grabs Hitler and he grabs Stalin and he brings him to the World Court. Like that version of Superman is like, how much good can I do? Well, how much power is at my disposal? If I'm sitting at the round table with six other people, some of whom power dwarf mine, you bet I'm going to be the one to be like, "Hey, why is hunger still a thing? That shouldn't be a thing we do. like, let's fix that." And everyone else is like, "Nah, I got my own drama. I'm dealing with this. I'm trying to get this girlfriend, everything else." And he's like, "No, man, this is, in a lot of ways, he's very Batman-esque. It's like, this is the mission. We have to strike while the iron's hot, while we have this ability." So I thought it was a consistent characterization all the way through, and I appreciated it so much.
No, as did I. But so eventually, kind of all of this snowballs, and when Clark has this opportunity to try to stop this bomber outside the Daily Star, he does it as Clark, and essentially kills off his civilian identity. And then to Brian's question there, we do get one of those backup stories where the Planet staff and George Taylor, like they're eulogizing Clark, and you get to see what he meant to all of them, which is a lovely moment. You even get a great little moment between Perry White and George Taylor. Perry calls him Georgie. It's like, what's the backstory there? It's like, I want to see more of that. Yeah. But then Clark, Superman, takes on this new civilian identity of Johnny Clark, a firefighter who transferred from the Keystone Fire Department. And really just keeps to himself. And it's like, once he's done saving people as Superman, he just goes over to the fire station and starts his shift. And at the time, I think even as recently as the read that I did of this for Ralph a couple of years ago, this was one of the things where I'm like, I don't like this, right? Like him just becoming Johnny Clark, the firefighter. But I think reading it again, it's exactly what Clark said he would do.
And also, it's there to reinforce why Clark is important in a world where his parents are gone and he doesn't seem to be connected to any of his friends from Smallville or other farmers or something. It's like he thinks, oh, I could just get rid of that. Like Chris calls me a cuckoo. Well, maybe that's what I am. I'll just adapt a new identity and I'll move on. This is what I was saying before. Like, part of what makes Superman is he has humanity. It's very deeply rooted in his character, and it defines who he is and what he wants to do. So yeah, you see that when he tries to get rid of that, he's a little weird, he's a little quiet, and he's not really enjoying himself, and he has to go back to it eventually. And the other people have to convince him, but he's happy to do it. And then once he does, he sees how much resources he has there, and in the end, he's able to defeat the big bad because of all the friends and relationships he's made in his Clark identity, as well as everything else. When the Legion travel back in time and see him on Smallville and see him before he's ever decided to call himself Superman. So I thought that was great. But past all of that, I just love him as a firefighter. I do. I love it so much. It's like Superman is not a police officer or anything else. At the end of the day, if it were up to him, he would just be helping people. It's like, oh, this building's on fire, there's a natural disaster. Superman is the original first responder. Like, I'm here, I'm putting myself in harm's way, I'm getting everyone I can, animal, minimal, vegetable, out of the way, out of harm's way as much as I can. So to see him actually with an engine was great. And again, if a random firefighter in Metropolis is a second Superman out there in some version of the story in the movie or in the comics or in that weird anime show that Ralph likes, like, I'm about it. Let's do it.
My Adventures with Superman?
My Adventures with Superman. I couldn't think of the name.
Great.
Thank you. No, I'm sure it is. I haven't watched it because I'm a lazy old man. I'm sure it's great. I really am.
No, but your point is well taken. It's funny because I'm like, I agree with you, man. I think that ultimately very much is the point that he learns he needs the Clark Kent identity, and Batman really kind of brings this message home with that flash drive, and it just kind of illustrates to Clark all the people he's helped as a reporter, all of these stories and all of the attention that he's brought to these issues. And ultimately, he's able to get his life back when his landlady reveals herself to be this imp hiding on Earth, and she has 3 wishes, and she uses one of them to essentially erase the death of Clark Kent.
Yeah.
I'm kind of kicking myself because it's like, why? I don't know why the firefighter thing would have bothered me so much in the past. When yes, ultimately the point is like you can't just adopt a new identity.
It's funny too because you keep saying like, I wish I had felt it a different way. I I think it's important to like if you didn't like something the first time, that's the right response to have to it because that's what you felt at the time. Just because you change your mind later isn't necessarily a bad thing. Like I would say the first time I read a lot of Morrison works, especially when I was younger, I hated them. I was like, what is this? Why is this so different from everything else? But the problem is that I couldn't stop thinking about it. So as I matured in my ability to have reading comprehension, I would come back to it and I would say, oh, I do like this. I like this for a different reason. So I always say the same thing. Like the fundamental difference between a Grant Morrison work and someone else's is when he writes it, he wants you to read it more than once. You know, comics are a disposable medium, but he's putting this down. He's saying, you know, you may have to read this two or three times, and maybe that third time's going to be a couple years from now, but you're going to get your money's worth, right? You're going to have some beautiful things to look at, and you might come away with something else. I mean, yeah, I know I go on a lot, but every time I read The Invisibles, I get something else out of it, even though it's like, you know, it's the same story. Nothing's changed about it. It's just me who's changed. It's just the reader who's changed.
I think I know I felt this way, so I imagine other Morrison readers have as well. Where sometimes you read it and you might feel a little bit lost, right? Or it might feel like things are happening arbitrarily sometimes. But yeah, when you really do spend the time with it and you go back and that's why like I'm glad I bought the hardcover with everything together in its proper reading order and you see it's like, oh no, all of this is being seeded through. There's a moment in one of the earliest issues where Nixley tells Clark, oh, three people were here looking for you, two guys and a blonde haired woman. That's not followed up on until like one of the final issues where you realize it was the Legion traveling through time trying to help him.
Yeah.
So things like that, it's like, yeah, it does it definitely rewards a reread and patience. And probably where we see the biggest instance of this throughout the entire 19 issue run is with Vyndktvx, who we see as this little man. We meet him, like we said on that first page, as this teetotaler. What we learn ultimately is that he's able to, I guess, affect the fates of people with objects, right? So he leaves that first scene with Glenn Morgan's tie. He leaves the scene in Smallville with Jonathan's handkerchief, right? Or something like that. But we see him pop up at various places. He interacts with Glenn Morgan. He interacts with Lex. Ultimately, we find out that he wanted to kind of get Glenn Morgan out of the way so that Luthor could kind of rise as this worse monster in his place. At the end of the first arc, we see him, quote unquote, hiring this hunter, Nimrod, to try to assassinate Superman. So we see, kind of numerous instances of him throughout all of this. So again, all of these little seeds, right, are there and do ultimately pay off. And then those two issues that we were mentioning that appear in the middle of the first arc, I assume due to art delays and deadlines and whatnot, but that really take place after, where we get an entire issue from the perspective of the Rocket. And there too, where in the issue where issue 2, when Superman is apprehended by the government after he stops the train, but it's like he's been hit by a bullet, i.e. a train, and he's taken to the government, and Lex is there in his role. And they think that, they correctly surmise he's an alien, but they think he's from a race of shapeshifters. And they bring in what we later learn is a deformed calf that Jonathan and Martha had in their truck the night they found the Rocket, right? So you read issue 2 and it's like, why the hell do they think he's a shapeshifter? What is this animal? And then you get that payoff. But that issue with the Rocket I thought was really cool, and we get our glimpse of Krypton and all of that.
Yeah.
And I welcome your thoughts on all that. And then immediately the subsequent issue, this is where I think it might bump people a little bit, because in that issue you're dealing with a time traveling legion of superheroes and the present day New 52 Superman, who's 5 years into his career. They're traveling back in time to the whatever you want to call it, the year 1 Superman and this Brainiac ship / Fortress of Solitude to try to retrieve this kryptonite engine core from the Rocket that Vyndktvx and his army of anti-Superman army have stolen. So a lot going on, but a lot of fun. But what was your take on the Krypton piece and the Rocket and all of that?
I love that the Rocket was able to be a character. I love that the Rocket was so important from welcoming him and talking to him and stating its mission up until when Superman uses it literally as an indestructible bullet to take out Brainiac and to reprogram Brainiac. I love that when you strip Superman back to his basics, and you mentioned before a lot of the things he that were taken from him. Well, a lot of that was the resources that he had built up, including what he was able to salvage from Krypton. Right, this very early Superman doesn't even know what Krypton is. Right, the Brainiac the Collector gives Lex the word to trip him up. Like, this whole thing is, he has no idea who he is. Why would he think he's anything other than everyone else with special gifts? And I love the use of the ship to bridge that connection. And I thought that was a really good use of that technology, because like everything from Krypton in this version is perfect and indestructible and great. Well, it's like, why wouldn't the cradle that brought him to Earth, that brought Moses down the river, as it were, why wouldn't that also be everything you wanted to be, everything you needed to be in the story? So I thought that was a great addition to it. I also liked that, we mentioned it before, that his cape is in a similar fashion. The cape is indestructible. I think there's another short story where like a kid gets a hold of it.
Yeah, the issue
I really
zero.
like,
Yeah.
yeah. And I thought that was another great thing, where it was like, all right, we know Clark's going to be indestructible when he gets older, when he gets comfortable with his powers and everything else. But no matter what, that cape is going to survive, because that's cape directly from Krypton. And I thought that was another great way of saying, you have a rich legacy that you're not aware of. But every time you come across one of these things, it is going to help you in your mission. It's going to be part of going on the hero's journey and getting tools as you come across it. When he reconnects with the ship, when he gets his cape, when he gets his indestructible suit, when he gets Candor, it builds up and it builds up and it builds up. And finally he's like, wait a second, my dad repelled you. You're not an angel. I know what's going on here. I remember you from the fairy tales my mom told me. Like, he gets all the tools from a world that's been dead for 30 light years worth of time to finally get his life back in order. And I thought, again, great. That took 3 reads, but that was 3 reads I'm happy to give you.
We'll circle back to that, but
sure, of course.
One question, no, I guess maybe not so much of a question, but is it your understanding that in this iteration, kryptonite is not an irradiated fragment of the world, but rather just a mineral from Krypton that, I don't know, under a yellow sun hurts him? Because it's like, it's the core that powers the rocket. Presumably that, would have been put there before the planet exploded and the radioactive kryptonite as we know it existed. Like, what is your view on that?
I have no idea. So again, I was very confused by the use of kryptonite in this story. You see the kryptonite man, kryptonite men. There are a bunch of people, and they have different versions. They talk about blue kryptonite a lot, which I thought meant we were going to see Bizarro, but I like their version of it better. So it's kind of used when the story calls for it. But yeah, I have no idea. I was surprised to see it as the core of the engine. I thought it was good for the story, but like, I started thinking, well, does that mean it's uranium and it would be harmful even if it were on Krypton, or did it get changed when it got here? I have no idea. I'm going to assume that the answer is, if there were any other mentions of kryptonite in the other books that Morrison wasn't writing at the time, maybe someone needed to reconcile all of that. But man, I have no idea. I really don't.
I mean, it's kind of taking us into Smallville TV show territory. And we talked about this when we did our whole run of episodes, because it's like, there's a point in season 9 where you get a flashback to Jor-El as he was preparing all of the artifacts to be sent to Earth. And he's infusing the orb that contains the Kandorian clones with blue kryptonite. It's like, wait, you have blue kryptonite on Krypton? Yeah. Like, what? So I don't know. I think I agree wholeheartedly with you. And I'm sure there are people out there who are more well-versed in the other New 52 Superman comics that were going on at the time who maybe this was accounted for or contradicted or what. But I feel like based on what we see here, the fact that kryptonite was the core of this rocket ship, like my interpretation is that unlike the way we typically think of it as irradiated fragments caused by the planet's destruction, it's just like they're minerals and that, maybe under a yellow sun, they hurt him.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Or maybe they would have hurt him on kryptonite. Again, maybe it's plutonium or uranium or whatever you need to power a ship that never seems to run out of energy that can go translate speed. So yeah, no, you're right. Again, a lot of the things don't seem to change under yellow sunlight. So maybe it's just a dangerous mineral on the planet. Maybe it's just what he needed, right? Like they didn't have a massive space program. If they did, more of them would have got off the world. So maybe he's just like Doc Brown. He's like, I need something that can power this ship. And the only thing we have is this incredibly dangerous mineral. It's like, well, okay, I'm going to wrap it in a thing of lead. It won't hurt him. It'll be fine. Don't worry about it. And then you get to Earth and it's like, oh, wow, this is really going to hurt you. We're going to make a big deal out of this. So
I think you're right. The fact that it was encased in lead does lead me to believe it's not a matter of the sun kind of activating it. I think I'm with you on that.
Because that was more of like a Silver Age thing when his powers started to get crazy. They needed to explain like, why can you and you alone do all of these things? But originally it was more musculature. It's like he leapt and he did everything else. It wasn't really based on like the solar thing. Siegel had a lot of influences. One of them is his book called Gladiator that I read because I'm a big nerd. And it literally talks about how like a human did this with like animal DNA and nonsense like that. So, I think keeping with the Golden Age theme, Morrison was probably like, all right, well, let's not worry about the solar radiation so much. Let's try to focus on, what he brings to the table as is. And, we'll get there eventually. There's that great scene where someone says, well, if you're going to leap into orbit, you need to make this speed. You've never gone over a fraction of this. And he goes, well, I've never needed to before. And then he does it. And you can hear the Superman theme when you're reading the damn thing because it's a work of beauty.
Yeah. I mean, just that notion, right, is such a theme of like, he'll do it because he has to do it. Right. And when the odds are impossible, do the impossible. Like on the note of the origin. And there's another thing that we've spoken a lot about over the years and kind of what tellings we like and the different aspects and all of that. In this idea of kind of stripping everything down, I like that. Yeah, in these stories, when we're with Jor-El and Lara on Krypton, the fact that they don't know which planet they're sending him to, right? Jor-El programs the ship to find a planet with a yellow sun, but it's not like, oh, we're sending him to Earth. Or we're sending him to the American Midwest, which we've seen. Or going back to my beloved Smallville, we're sending him to the farm that I went to. Yeah.
That was a great episode.
When I banged Lana's aunt back on my walkabout. So I like that just that notion of, and kind of like what I've always loved about Superman Birthright, of just like casting him out and, and not knowing if he's going to make it, not even knowing exactly where he's going. Something very elemental about that. That I really do like. And I love, particularly in the backstories, when we see everything that Jonathan and Martha had been going through, trying to get pregnant. I mean, there's this great sequence where they go to church and they talk to their priest and they're like, what, like, why is God punishing us? And it's a Baptist church, by the way, because that comes up a lot of times. You always talk about how most stories, you don't see them at church, but it's like, they probably would be church going people. And it's like, what denomination would they be? So we see them at a Baptist church for whatever that's worth. And just kind of everything that they're going through, and the guilt that Martha feels. They had gotten pregnant through this expensive in vitro process, and then she lost the baby, and then they start looking into adoption, and that's a very long and costly process. And then, of course, they are bestowed with this child from the stars, and we don't see a ton of Clark as an adolescent, but through the main story, especially that Legion issue where they time travel to that time, and some of the flashbacks, we do get some glimpses into that. And I mean, you see Clark once again in his young Clark in t-shirt and jeans with the cape, right? Like the lone connection to his home world. And you get the sense, right, in those conversations between young Clark and Pa, like he knows he came from a rocket ship from space, right? And he questions, were they ever going to come back for me? Or if they were going to come back, they probably would have come back by now. But he doesn't really have any of those answers. And to your point, he learns them in that first arc and dealing with Brainiac, which, as I've said, I don't love it when he learns about where he's from and what happened to his planet from a villain. He learns it from Lex in Birthright. He learns it, here with Brainiac. He learns it from Lobo in like Man of Tomorrow and American Alien miniseries. I don't know. Maybe it just feels too cruel to me, like that information is being delivered to our hero by an adversary versus him going on this quest and learning the answers for himself and then embarking on his journey. It's not the hill I'm going to die on, but it's like,
Sure.
It's not my favorite aspect of it or favorite version of it.
That's so interesting. I feel the opposite way. I always love that for two reasons. One, Superman is a character who's known for being very hard to hurt. But you tell him the truth and you can prove it, you're going to hurt him pretty bad. And I always thought that was a great way in an origin story to have someone, who's like, I'm not lying to you. I can prove this, and you have no idea. And this is awesome because you're gonna feel this. But the other side of that too is usually when the character is presenting this awful news to young Clark who doesn't even have a chance to mourn, they themselves are an evil alien influence, right? Like, what is Brainiac other than every 1950s stereotype of the awful alien invader? He's here, he's inhuman, he's inhumane, he's going to take you. You've just become interesting enough to him that he's arrived and he's going to treat you the way we would treat insects. And then to give this knowledge to Clark, and for Clark to immediately turn around and go, well, that sucks. These are my people, and you are not going to do here what you've done to any other place. Reaffirms that even though Clark now knows for certain that he's from somewhere else and he is of a different people, he's human and he's here, and he is absolutely, no questions asked, going to protect everyone from someone who is from out there but wishes to do them harm. And I always thought that was a great dichotomy, because it's like your enemy has stabbed you and still you're like, this sucks, this is really awful, but I'm going to continue doing what I'm doing. And if anything, this awful knowledge makes me know that, I'm doing the right thing because I've chosen to do this. I'm not like you. I'm not an oppressor, and I'm certainly not someone who would view someone else as lesser than me. So I don't know. I always appreciated that.
You might be winning me over. Yeah. No, I do like that. And I think these stories that I cited, even though it's not what I want for my character, it's like, the dramatic storytelling value of that is apparent to me. So I think there's something to be said for that. I do love here the fact that we do get this visitation from the Legion of Superheroes, and they take him flying and get a very nice nod. That's what I'm saying. Between those Easter eggs we mentioned before and moments like this, it's a fresh start for the character. Yes, we've stripped a lot away, but we've also incorporated a lot from the larger lore and mythology. And so I really do like that. I like that a lot. Now, go ahead.
Well, to an extent, because the way I read the ending of this run is that the Legion realized they have to sacrifice themselves, and I always found that heartbreaking. I'm not even a Legion of Superheroes fan. And I know when the New 52 came out, there was no Legion book. And to watch over the course of these 18, 19 issues, his last true set of friends who he always had, Otto Binder creations, from back in the day, G1 characters realize over time that like their future, where Universo is in charge and all these things seem to be wrong, when they finally realize what's happening, there was like, nope, if we're really going to follow his example, then we really have to do this, and to sacrifice the Legion, to end Long Live the Legion, to finally have it come to an end so that Superman can continue in this new, strange new world is beautiful. It really is. There's a line in here about how there was no Justice Society of America post New 52, whatever the hell it was called, Flashpoint. So Clark keeps saying things like, they keep using this word I've never heard before, superhero, right?
Yeah.
Like they're coming up with words to describe a person who can do amazing things and wants to do the best. And the fact that the Legion live up to that, to ultimately sacrifice themselves at the end, it was heartbreaking to me, because it was like, oh man, you don't even realize what you lost in this, but they were willing to do it because they knew it would help you.
And that whole idea about the Justice Society and their absence, obviously that becomes a major point in Doomsday Clock, right? Where without their inspiration, Clark never becomes Superboy. He's not there to save his parents. And then once that is quote unquote fixed, the timeline unfolds differently. So,
but it's cool too, because it's like, just like in the real world, the first real superhero was this scrappy guy, and then all these other ones popped up, and then they realized like, oh hey, we can make a group out of this. But Superman is Superman, right? He predates the Justice Society. He kept being published after they went away. He was there for the Justice League. He kept being published. Every time the Justice League falls apart, there's still going to be a new issue of Action Comics no matter what. So I don't know, I thought it worked really well. And I love the Justice Society. I mean, you give me Golden Age, you give me them fighting World War II, I am there for that.
100%, one of my favorite teams, and I'm glad that they're back in play after being off the board for a while. But so throughout this run, and starting from that first arc, because Brainiac comes not to destroy, but to preserve a sample, not to paint him in too heroic a light, but to preserve a sample of the planet before the coming multitude, right? Which has destroyed other worlds and almost destroyed Krypton, but for the efforts of Jor-El, who was able to repel the multitude, do the impossible.
Yeah.
And there are other warnings from characters throughout the arc. There's a character who's introduced about midway through, the Blake Farm ghost, right? Adam Blake.
Captain Comet.
Captain Comet, who is imbued with powers. Is it Clark's ship that's passing over that gives him the powers, or just a different meteor, or could a comet?
Oh, that's a good question. I didn't think it was, but I kind of like that actually. That's pretty cool. I No, I thought it was an actual comet, but yeah, I see no reason why it can't be his ship. Yeah, that makes sense.
I don't know that was the intention though, but I don't know.
Well, they're from the same part of the from
Yeah.
the same part of the country, so actually, no, that makes a lot more sense. Yeah,
So maybe.
maybe I like that.
But anyway, he develops these powers and then is recruited by the Cometeers. I don't know Captain Comet really.
Oh, no one does. No, he was this weird late 50s character. I think his claim to fame is he predates Barry Allen by a couple of years. So from a certain point of view, he's the first Silver Age character, but he didn't catch on. The way I read him here is with the lack of the Justice Society and with Captain Comet's place in science fiction superherodom, Morrison wanted to say, well, not only Clark's not just the first person to get powers, he's the first person to get powers and decide to help everyone. Captain Comet didn't seem to have that luxury. He got powers and he was quickly ostracized because he was raised by like dark versions of the Kents. And then, yeah, the way I take it is he met up with other on Earth. You're a new sapien, you're a new person, a person of tomorrow person. And they all got together and then he teamed up with other ones. And together they are the Cometeers, which I don't think was a team that existed before Morrison. And then, yeah, you see their benefactors, which again, unlike what we see of Krypton and everything else, these are like real Lovecraftian weird creatures that don't say or do anything. So the whole thing is like, what is Captain Comet? Oh, he's Superman. If Superman were hard science fiction and lacked that human component, right? If didn't feel any empathy or compassion for the people he found here, which I thought was a good compare and contrast. But again, you need him to beat the villain too, right? You need him and you need Lois's niece and you need all the others. You can't remove one piece or else the villain wins, which I thought was pretty cool.
Yeah, no, for sure. But yeah, he and his people, like they warn of this coming attack. When Superman is helping the colony on Mars, they are attacked by this multitude, this horde of demonic-looking angels, I guess, for lack of a better description. And so looming over all of this, right, is this threat of the multitude. But we find out, like much of what's going on in this run, right, it's Vyndktvx. Do you want to explain about the fork? Because that seems to kind of inform what what this is all about.
Yeah, absolutely. So the multitude is the name of a weapon from the fifth dimension. When you use a fifth dimensional weapon on the third dimension, which is where Superman lives, it is a fork or a multi-pronged instrument, and it crosses into his world through the fourth dimension, which is time, and it hits him at multiple points at the same time. So when the fork interacts with the real world, it takes the form of a horde of angels. I have no idea why. I thought it was a cool visual. It goes all the way back in time. It kills a bunch of worlds we've never been experienced to. It tries to kill Krypton. Jor-El fights him back. It kills John and Martha. It goes in the future, it puts Universo in power. It attacks people in the middle. It kills off all the interesting things. But from the perspective of the fifth dimension, it's all happening at once. He only gets one thrust with this sword and it hits all the points of the third dimension at the same time. The angels are just the way it looks here. But if you were in the fifth dimension, you would see the most beautiful weapon ever crafted by anyone. And then in our reality, it looks like evil angels. It looks like whatever it has to be to get rid of everything. It's the same way that, back in the day, Mr. Mix could use his powers to do anything. But really what Mr. Mix is he's a stand-in for the writer. The writer can write a new script. He can draw a new panel. He can use the eraser. That's what the fifth dimension is. It's just imagination. He can just do whatever he wants to do. But we see that when you choose to be an aggressive imp, you have limitations because, you shouldn't be evil if you have that much power. It's kind of the main takeaway from the story.
Thank you for laying that out so eloquently. And the kind of the demonstration that we see in the issue is literally taking a fork and like stabbing a piece of paper or whatever, and it has those four marks, and so that's kind of the idea here, just writ large with this fifth dimensional weapon.
There's one more quick visual for that. Is the way it was explained to me back in the day was, if you look at your hand, you have a single instrument that ends in 5 digits. But if you were to press your hand through a piece of paper, the one hand to you is 5 different things from the perspective of the paper. So that's like, it's just math. Like, there's a way to explain this mathematically, but it's that idea of like what a higher dimension is a different way of measuring things being pushed down on something else. So that's kind of the way to think about it, is like, from your perspective, the hand is one instrument. From the perspective of the paper, it's 5 fingers, and it can't see how it all connects together, but it could if it could see things the way you did.
Yeah. And once again, well said. So we also get a lot of backstory about what went down in the fifth dimension, just kind of this notion that the king was very sad after his wife had died and no one could make him laugh, including Vyndktvx, the court jester of sorts. And then Mxyzptlk comes along and is able to make the king laugh, and really takes it to the next level with his favorite, not his greatest, as we learn, but his favorite trick, Superman, right? And the fact that Superman can play these tricks back, and it's very amusing to the king. And Vyndktvx is the envious one, right? And he ends up killing the king and blaming Mxyzptlk for it, and setting his sights, like we said, on Superman himself. And as we start to learn all of this, this is now where time does start to bend a bit more in these stories, especially we get into the last handful of issues or so, where, like we said, we have that issue of Superman attempting to save the folks on Mars. They ultimately lose their lives, but they'll be restored at the end of the story when he asks Nyxly to use her final wish to bring them back. But that's where he's on Mars and he's dealing with the quote unquote multitude. But that's an older Superman, right, a little bit further along. And then the next issue, we're back with our young Superman on the roof talking to Nyxly about this backstory. And so I think if for anyone who's looking to read this for the first time or reread it, just kind of go in knowing that you're going to be bouncing back and forth a little bit. And there's enough context to play so you can place where you are. But that's where, again, all these various attacks are converging. And, we've mentioned this anti-Superman army, includes a number of folks. We mentioned the, K-Man or Kryptonite Man, Nimrod, this hunter, Susie, Lois's, well-meaning, but really forced into doing this. Precocious, yes. The niece, Susie. She's from the Golden Age, right? They did stuff with her niece. Right?
I have no idea.
I meant to look this up, but I'm almost positive it was. Her name may very well have been Susie, but yeah, there's something I remember those early Golden Age stories, like with her niece, something like that. Who else do we have? Oh, I don't know if I'm saying this, but Zadu, the Phantom Zone escapee.
Zadu. That's how I pronounced it.
Yeah. Who we see a glimpse of earlier, but then really gets to play in the Crypto issue.
Oh, Crypto.
Yeah. So he was this scientist, I guess, on Krypton who was experimenting with suspended animation, and things went awry, and they banished him to the Phantom Zone. And when Jor-El and Lara were trying to save their entire family, their idea was to go through the Phantom Zone. But when they tried to do this, they were attacked by Zadu and the other inmates, and Crypto sacrificed himself, right? Bit Zadu's arm and was pulled into the Phantom Zone. And then we get this issue. Now, I think it's issue 13. It's the Halloween set issue. And it's I forget the ghost, what's it called? Ghost Dog or something to that effect. The Ghost of the Fortress, something like that. That is set later in the timeline, right? Because he's in his Arctic fortress, right? Not the Brainiac ship. But Zadu is able to escape and imprison Superman in the zone, and that's where he reunites with Whistles for Crypto. I mean, James Gunn must have read this run.
Pretty sure he's read this one once or twice. Yeah.
But it was great. And then when the scene that, my God, broke my heart is when Crypto, after Superman has defeated Zadu and escaped from the zone himself, but wasn't able to save Crypto initially, and you just see Crypto sitting in the white void, waiting for what felt like 1,000 years.
Yeah.
Oh God! But then, of course, Superman arrives and is able to pull him out and flies him to. We love when we go to the sun. And restore him. I love that. I thought it was great.
Yeah, I don't have any nostalgia for Crypto, but this run sold me on it. I love the idea that, he survived because he did a good thing, right? Like that was the thing. It's like you were able to come to Earth, you're able to get reunited with this boy you loved, and you did it because you risked your life to save a bunch of people. And it's like, oh, great, yeah, no, that makes him an active part of the story. You know, he's not just Superman's dog; he's Superman's protector. And I love that. I love that he comes back out. And he's able to get reintegrated into the story. I thought it was really good. Also, that issue has a random appearance by the Phantom Stranger, who
Yes.
again is a character I love. I have no idea why. He got particularly screwed over with the New 52, so I was happy to revisit him at that time.
Yeah, it's like he was called to a haunting in Metropolis. He ended up getting stuck in the Phantom Zone.
Yeah,
And then that issue has one of my other favorite backup stories where you see that the Phantom of Crypto has been with Clark
yeah,
all along. Through the highs and lows, it was heartbreaking. And another callback to a seed that had been planted earlier, where Clark's in the park and this homeless person is walking by pushing their cart, and they're like, "There's a
yeah.
white dog, a white ghost sitting with you,"
I,
and proved to be true.
I love the use of the Phantom Zone, not as just solely a prison, but as a representation of the ethereal. It's you mentioned before magic, but really when it comes down to Superman, it's all science, seen from a very different point of view. And I think the Phantom Zone is one of those great concepts where, like, yeah, it's this other place where you don't have a body, but it's called the Phantom Zone because it sits on top of what we can see, and we can't always perceive it, but sometimes you can, and sometimes it can interact. And Zadu has so much hate in him that he might actually be able to push in like a ghost or a poltergeist or something. And I always thought that was cool because it's like, when Superman gets up there in powers and he gets all his super senses and he can see and look at things and everything else. And it's like, oh, what are hauntings? What are all this other stuff? What are these premonitions? Oh, they're actual bad guys that my forebears put into this jail, and now they're the only survivors of science heaven that blew up. So I always thought that that was a cool way of introducing, not only more things for Clark to have to fight against, but like, it gives another vibe, Superman and the horror story, because Zod or Ursa or Chris is, reaching through from indispensable hell, immaterial hell, excuse me.
I'm with you. I got a couple more questions for you. I want to get your take on, and then I want to go to our patron questions as well. So, we've already kind of talked a decent bit, I think, about the climax of this when, Vyndktvx makes his final assault and the anti-Superman army converge and the skies are red, and we're building towards the second and final death of Superman. And we talked about how Superman ultimately has this realization about how it's all one attack for Vyndktvx, but for him, he's experienced it all these times and he's learned, and he'll never give up. And Vyndktvx, I guess his fatal flaw, his mistake, is connecting Superman to everyone in the world. He wants them to feel their suffering, but instead Superman is able to exploit that connection and turn it on Vyndktvx. And he realizes he can't get Vyndktvx to say his name backwards, but he can call upon everyone in the world to say their names backward, because fifth dimensional words, when uttered in our world, are like thunder.
Like
They
thunder.
boom like thunder. Now, this is what I wanted to, it's a long way of asking you a question, but there's a key figure who's mentioned, but then doesn't enter until very deep into the story here. And that's Ferlin. Am I remembering? Ferlin, right?
Mm-hmm.
The son
Yeah,
of Mixie and Nixley, who turns out to be, I guess, grown from the arm of Vyndktvx, such that when everyone in the world, including Ferlin, say their name backwards, that includes Vyndktvx said backwards. So I guess my question is, did everyone in the world saying their name, you know where I'm going? Like, did everyone in the world saying their name backwards, did that actually matter? Or really it was just about the limb that was grown into Ferlin saying it backwards?
I think they both mattered. And the reason I say that is the idea of everyone in the world having to say their name backwards, I read as reader participation. So Morrison has said before that he's very into old comics that would have the character talking to the reader. There's that famous cover of The Flash saying, "Stop, if you read this, I'm going to die." And Morrison has said that's one of, if not his favorite comic book of all time. And he's done this before, in The Invisibles, you have to be part of the magic spell. In Zatanna, you have to touch her on the page. I know I go back to this a lot. I know you're not a big fan, but in Dragon Ball Z, Goku has something similar where the viewers at home are supposed to give him their spirit energy so he can defeat basically the devil. And I really thought it was the same thing here. It was like everyone has to say their name backwards. Every reader, every person, because that's the only way we're going to beat the devil. But to your point, at the end of the day, it really only comes down to Ferlin. Now, if Ferlin had done it and no one else had, would Vyndktvx have been beaten? Yeah, maybe. If he hadn't said it and everyone else in the world did it as well, that's a hell of a magic spell. So that would have probably defeated him as well. Did the combination of both of those things guarantee that that happens? Well, yeah, because they also go out of their way. And again, this is Morrison saying you can read this all ways. No, one thing he says about the Invisibles all the time is there's no wrong way to read this. If you got something out of it makes sense to you, that's as valid as anything else. That's his whole thing about how to consume his work. But anyway, they do make a point of saying that Ferlin is a damaged limb. So that was my way of reading, like, oh, okay, that's your out, right? Like he's not 100% Vyndktvx, but he is a part of him, as above, so below, as it were. So it's like, yeah, he needed to do that, but maybe he wouldn't have been enough on his own. And then, Susie, early on, when she's talking to Lois, she actually says all this nonsense, and Lois is like, "I have no idea what you're talking about, but I'm interested because you're interested. You're a pretty weird but cool kid." And she says that she's like, "What would happen if everyone did that? If everyone had a name?" And it's this idea, like, an imp from the fifth dimension is the same thing as like a genie. That's why Miss Nixel has 3 wishes. It's all this same thing. It's like the terms and names that we use to describe these creatures in our mythology, they've always been these fifth dimensional imps. So we know the rules. It's embedded in our stories and our culture, just like Superman is embedded in our stories and culture. He's using the weapons that are already there to get rid of the devil and save everyone. So again, I read it as going both ways. If you're sitting at home and you want to figure out what your name is backwards and you say it out loud, well, you help defeat the devil. But if you don't want to bother with all that, well, we made sure Ferlin was here because, Mr. Mix has always been in charge of this anyway, and he took care of it for you. But either way, Superman is going to make sure that the right tools are used to get the result that benefits the most people.
I like all of that. And ultimately, I guess where I land is, for me, it's both, and it has to be both. I feel like if the world uniting towards this common purpose really didn't matter and it was just about Ferlin, I think that takes something away from it. Yet at the same time, if you take Ferlin out of the equation, then I'm kind of left wondering, well, how did that actually really send them back? So
brute force, right? I mean, it's just at the end of the day,
that's true.
It's like a denial of service attack. It's brute force. Plus, he's exhausted. They say at one point, it's like Vyndktvx is not a warrior, right? Like he grabbed Excalibur off the wall and he thinks like, oh, I hate you and I'm going to take you out. And Mr. Mix is like, no, you idiot. You can't beat Superman. That's the point of Superman. Like he's a better story than you are. You can't beat him. And you're exhausted from fighting him over his entire time. All you did was make him stronger.
Yeah. And I do have to say, I mentioned this earlier, but when Superman has a final encounter with his former landlady, right? And she talks about how like you don't even know what you lost. And essentially saying like I can use this last wish to restore. I don't know if that's totally on the table, but to help him. And he's committed to this journey that he's on, right? And he instead has her use her wish. It can only be used on something red. So the red planet Mars, where all of those astronauts had been killed by the multitude. So just that self-sacrifice, another powerful moment for the character. But the one of my last questions for you before we get to our patrons is, one aspect from the traditional Superman lore that's, really not here is a romance with Lois, but honestly, even just romance in general. Now, I know elsewhere in the New 52, we would have the whole Superman Wonder Woman business. So it's not like the line as a whole was devoid of it, but specifically in the realm of this run, there really wasn't space for that. We got a platonic, dynamic between Lois and Clark. I really did like the fact that Clark was a fan of her writing, right? Which he confesses to Jimmy right before he's not going to be crashing on Jimmy's couch anymore. And then Lois too. There's an exchange between Lois and Jimmy where they're going to meet Clark and Jimmy's like, come on, like you love all of his blog posts that you read. So I do love the fact that they're fans of each other's work. Yeah. Right. And there's that respect there. But I guess just generally, how did you feel about this dynamic between the two of them or just kind of the lack of a romantic component to the story?
I didn't mind it so much, but I will say I like that Lois had stuff to do, even if she wasn't always the most active participant in her story. I love that Metello only exists because this guy is so convinced that he and Lois were meant to be, and Lois is like, "No, you're a creep, and you're like really into my dad, and I'm not about any of that." And he's willing to sacrifice himself to become this horrible, heartless, creature just because of the way she looks at Superman. And I thought that that was great motivation because again, it's a really human thing. It's like, we're dealing with gods and unknowable Lovecraftian machines and all this other nonsense. But at the end of the day, jealousy is why we do 99% of the stupid things we do. So I thought that that was a really cool use of it. I also, again, I love Lois, the investigative reporter. I really do. I think that she's a good enough character to stand on her own. And the fact that she is constantly pursuing her father and pursuing the truth and pursuing everything else. It's like, well, we don't see the love story start here, and maybe to your point, that's because other things were going on in other books. But we know they're going to end up together. They're going to be together in the sun, and you see why. Because they both have this like dogged commitment to the truth that it, over everything else in their lives. And I feel like that's the one thing that unites them more than anything else. And that's really on display here. So, maybe if things had been different, we had gotten another year, we would have seen them competing for bylines and flirting and the love triangle and all that other stuff. But I don't know. I just don't think he had the real estate.
Yeah, I hear you on that. Yeah, it's funny. I don't mind the lack of a romance between the two of them as much as you might expect. And I'm on record. I actually liked the Clark Diana pairing in other stories in the New 52. And as I said in our confessions episode last week, it's like, no, if you ask me, like, I can only have one version of the story, would I want it to be Superman and Wonder Woman? No. But if you're going to start Action Comics over with number one and start the character from scratch, it's like, you should do some different stuff. So that aspect of him, I wouldn't have minded. I don't know if maybe Lana had come to visit or something. I wouldn't have minded a little bit of that. I just like that, have that component in these stories. So we do have a few more comments and questions from our patrons. So our pal Rick Reason said, just reread all of the Morrison Superman and New 52 recently, and for me, it really held up. Do you wish he had stayed in that early era longer?
Yes, I wish he'd still been. I mean, it's been 14 years, but again, it's like, he did one recently called Superman and the Authority, and it's the character of Superman in there is very similar to this, and I was eating it up. I was like, please give me more of this. I don't care what continuity it's in. I don't. Everyone's very happy with Jonathan Kent. Great, have 6 books with him, but give me one with this guy. Give me an annual a year where Johnny Clark steps in from a portal and just does something awesome, and reminds the world where it's like, again, with great power must come great responsibility. The guy who put a 6-legged calf in a rocket ship because he thought it was funny and he thought it might help his wife get through the worst tragedy imaginable. It's like, I want to watch his son throw, corrupt billionaires off a building. I really want that. I want that more than, I thought I'd be comfortable admitting. So yeah, please, 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 please.
I echo that. I mean, it's like, as much as I enjoyed the stories that followed, and what I will say, I guess either I had forgotten this or it was lost on me, but we do, because of the time bending, it's like we do continue to bounce back and forth from that early time. And in these stories, even when he gets his Kryptonian costume on Brainiac's ship, he still continues to throw on the t-shirt and jeans from, I guess, when he's really in a rush or whatnot. So I feel like we still kind of, throughout this run, we do maintain a connection to that. But to Rick's question and to what you said, it's like, yeah, to really live in the t-shirt and jeans champion of the oppressed era of the character for longer, that's one of the things that I wish we had more artistic consistency throughout this. And I wish that we could have stayed in that longer, even though I enjoyed what came later. And to your point, it's like, yeah, I think they just, they have so many issues to work with. I get it, but it's just, I don't know. It feels like leaving something on the table to not mine that version even more.
I also like the idea. I know this is stupid, but I like the idea that the clothes fall apart. Like
Yeah.
the reason he's wearing jeans and work boots, so that's what people work for a living wear. And the fact that he when he steps up to the plate and when he does something super, they start falling apart on him, and he's got to put on the other costume because it's like, oh man, I got to go punch out an alien invader the size of a small asteroid. It's like unfortunately I can't do that wearing this other stuff. But it's like am I going out on patrol? Am I fighting an evil robot? Am I dealing with something Luther did? It's like, well, I'm wearing what I'm most comfortable in because I want the people in the neighborhood to know I'm here for them. I'm not flying above them. I'm leaping alongside them. Like, the whole point of Golden Age Superman 2 is he didn't fly. He almost like web slung. He was amidst the tall buildings. He was amidst the people. They could look up and they could see that cape flutter. He was really about the people and about the city. So I think it's the same thing here. I think when he's out there and he wants everyone to know what he's doing, he wears his clothes to go to work in.
Yeah, I like that aspect too. And obviously it's a departure from the post-crisis slash pre-Flashpoint version where he has the aura, right? That aura around him. Like that's what.
Oh, Johnny Byrne. Oh, my
right.
God.
And that's why
yeah.
his skin tight costume remains intact, but the cape is often tattered, as opposed to the pre-crisis version of like, these are the materials, the blankets, or the material from the blankets that he arrived to Earth on. And that's why it's indestructible. So, but no, yeah, I like that. Yeah, they're just, like you said, he gets these t-shirts printed up, his jeans and work boots, and they get tattered.
Yeah,
like
man.
the cape remains. That's that connection point to his home world. And
They're dirty, right? They're dirty. Like you could never, wasn't some editor, some guy turned it in, he was sweating, and it's like, you can't trust Superman sweating. You do this again, you're off the book. And it's this idea of like, no, these birds are dirty, man. They're cuffed, right? Like he's running, he's jumping, he's leaping, he's punching things out. Sometimes he wears a white one because the blue one's in the laundry, the red one's getting torn. It's like, this is a guy who's like, I want to be a symbol, absolutely, but also I'm like a normal person, and I'm gonna grab whatever's clean or cleanish.
yeah, that's the thing. Despite taking the Kents off the board, this didn't have the effect of removing him, making him feel more removed from humanity, right? More detached or anything like that. And he is a man of the people. The people who, when they find out he's an alien, turn on him, hate him, protest against him, throw rocks at him until Metropolis is bottled. And then they need his help. And then they give him the key to the city. But he's there for them nonetheless.
He does it.
How
many of us would have been like, screw you guys. This is absolutely ridiculous. I am leaving. I'm going to Kandor. I'm going somewhere else. I'm getting out of here. You guys have fun with the evil angels. But, Superman turns around and goes, this sucks, and we're going to fix this, and this sucks, but I'm not abandoning you because I wouldn't want to be abandoned if I were in your position, right? It's like the golden rule. It's almost religious. So I love that because this is what I was talking about before. It's like how many alien invaders show up and they do the worst thing and they show us the worst of ourselves, right? Brainiac is the internet. That's how he gets here. He comes on a ship, but fundamentally he's the internet. Brainiac is just, in this continuity, Brainiac is just what Kryptonians call their internet. So I love that, where it's like, yeah, everyone's going to turn on him and Lex is going to be right and it's going to be horrible, but Superman's going to save them. Lex wouldn't have saved them. Brainiac wouldn't have saved them. Superman's going to save them. And then when this is done and they look up and they realize he's still there, again, they might be better to each other, which I think is what he's trying to accomplish.
Totally. Our pal Chase Nielsen here says, I'm so glad you're covering Grant Morrison's Action Comics run again. I love the t-shirt and jeans look and his powers being early in their development. It goes a long way in making Superman feel like an underdog. The stakes feel extra high as he's captured and tortured by Luthor or trying to jump into space to face Brainiac. And I love that he's a scruffy, relentless reporter looking out for the little guy. He's an outcast and champion for the oppressed. I will admit the Vyndktvx storyline meanders a bit, but I do enjoy the Mxyzptlk world and magic coming up against Superman. The villain attacking Superman in 4 dimensions from multiple points in time all at once was creative and had some good emotional beats. Yeah.
Welcome.
I
mean, again, I'm not saying the Vyndktvx stuff is evil. I mean, easy and it's definitely rushed, but man, you start with him fighting that train. You start with him yelling, "Save me!" You start with him saying, "Is the law going to work the same for the wealthy and the poor?" Well, until it does, here I am, and I'm bulletproof. And then you get to the end where he's like, "No, I need every single person I've ever met to help me to defeat this guy. And if it do, we're all going to have it tomorrow, and it's going to be one I share with you." It's a dense work, but again, I keep going back to it year after year.
Totally. Logan says, I'm glad to see you taking another pass at Morrison's action run as well. I think a lot of the most interesting ideas are in the last story arc. I'm curious to hear what you think about Morrison's hints that the New 52 Superman was always Superman Red, which Superman Reborn would later canonize. So yeah, and we had hit on that earlier. I mean, I guess I didn't give it a ton of thought. I mean, when we talk about Superman Red, Superman Blue, of course, there was that Silver Age story, imaginary story where Superman splits himself in two and lives these two distinct lives, one with Lana, one with Lois, one on Earth, one on Krypton. And then, as you and I, children of the post-crisis era, remember vividly, after Superman got his electric powers, he was split into red and blue, and they had distinct personalities. I always felt that they could have been more clearly delineated, and we could have gone deeper on there. But the red one was more brash, right, compared to the blue one. And apparently, all of this really stemmed from colorist Glenn Whitmore, who colored all of the Triangle era books, and he was just like.
Oh, okay.
Loved the idea of Superman Red, Superman Blue. It was like always pitching it, and then finally got his moment. So, and then, like we said, at the end of this arc, we see him kind of split into red and blue, and then you get to that reborn arc later, and you have the red and blue energies converging. I mean, I guess if we're looking at Superman Red as kind of more of like the brash hothead, and that's the new 52, yeah, I mean, I guess that tracks.
Yeah, no, headcanon accepted. I always liked Superman Red. I always thought that he was more in line with the version I wanted to see of the character, who is this one. So yeah, I think that's awesome. I'm gonna read a little bit more into that. Yeah.
Yeah. And then we'll circle back to Brian where we started with our patron questions earlier. He had a couple of other comments. He said, and we hit on this. I never liked the jarring art change between Rags and Brad Walker in the last issue of the Brainiac arc. I wish they had either let Rags have an extra week or two for those pages, or at least let him finish and put them in the trade like they did for J.G. Jones at Final Crisis. Any thoughts on that? And we also saw that with, I guess, Phil Jimenez with Infinite Crisis, where there were pages that weren't finished, and then he got to draw them for the collected edition.
And Phil Jimenez on the Invisibles as well.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I don't know. How do you feel about this?
I've been thinking of a nice way to say this. I don't like Rags Morales' art.
Oh, okay. You know what? When I said earlier I'm a fan, your reaction made me think that you maybe didn't. You didn't share that.
I have never been. Again, I'm not saying it's bad. Not at all. I don't know art at all. I just know that when I see his art, my eyes kind of glaze over. So I am not a fan of his art in general. I don't think this is bad. I love the design work, especially in the very visceral, like Mark Bagley-esque motion that he does. But overall, I think part of me even preferred Brad Walker. But I was never really sold on it. Identity Crisis was the same thing. I was like, why do they look like this? So I don't know. I was never really sold on that. But to that point, I would like one consistent art style. So I mean, if they're ever going to put out an edition where it's like, oh, he gets to draw the rest of the pages, I would happily support that.
Yeah. No, I mean, like I said, I do like his style. I like the humanity that he brings. And I think for something like Identity Crisis in particular, it served the story well, in my view. But maybe there's something to be said, right, about the right pairing. So whether this style was best suited for a Morrison work or not, I don't know. But I mean, to Brian's question, would I want them to allow him to finish pages? I mean, yeah, if that's ever an option, then the artist gets paid and we get to see I would never be opposed to that. But I feel like those instances though are so few and far between, right? And usually reserved for like a big event where it's like, okay, we want this collected edition to have it.
I mean, listen, the 25th anniversary or whatever of this, if they're going to turn around and do that, I could see them doing it. I mean, you mentioned in the collected edition, they reordered things and whatever. I mean, listen, you get a really good editor, someone who's passionate about it. They'll get it done. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what makes a good collected edition, is someone who's passionate about the content in there. And that separates it from just a random collected edition that needs to get out on time and something that's a tome, something that you're happy to have on your shelf and that you go back to. I mean, you look at Watchmen or Kingdom Come or any of DC's evergreen titles. It's like every time a new one comes out, there's something in there that I have to get, even though I got 3 of the other ones. So, if there's someone out there who, like me and now like you, really loves this thing and wants to do that, like, again, I'm happy to buy it. You just let me know.
And then Brian's last comment, he said, while Morrison does a great job with a modern day origin story with a social crusader angle, I think the arcs as a whole also function as part of the Superman ongoing narrative. The status quo can be read and understood completely independently of Flashpoint, which is good because I never read it. It's more like Vyndktvx did his thing, took out the Kents, and that sent Clark on a branching path, not Flashpoint or even Dr. Manhattan, which was retrofitted later anyway.
Dr. Manhattan.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously we hit on that before. And you know who I forgot in all of this? On top of Manhattan and then the other players from the Metal Wars and whatnot. Pandora, remember Pandora? As the New 52 worlds were being created, she had her hand. So there were a lot of but that's
the Pandora from the New 52, the Trinity of Evil
yes,
Pandora, right?
yeah,
She was in every single, yeah. Okay. Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
But that's the thing, and you and I were talking about this maybe in our episode or off mic, but we were at our local comic shop, right, as this was coming out, and again, I was really checked out, so I guess this didn't bother me so much, although I was probably happy to join in the complaining because I was not on board with it generally. But like, you remember people trying to figure out how this fit in with the New 52 Superman title and everything else, right?
Yeah. And I never got it because it's like, listen, guys, two different, very different. The late great George Perez is drawing this book. Enjoy that for what it is. You know, it's a man at the top of his game drawing that book. If you're awake at night trying to figure out how these two stories talk to each other, maybe you have to admit that they don't, and that real people with real deadlines work on this stuff. Like, enjoy that for what it is. Enjoy this for what it is. And as Stan Lee used to say, if there's an incongruity, you come up with a reason why it makes sense. You know, that's the whole thing. It's like, you guys got to, if this is so important to you, you tell us. You know, you've read all this stuff, you've worked your imagination figuring this stuff out. So you tell us. But I don't know. At that point in my career, in my fandom, I was just following creators. You know, I was like, well, what's the story Grant Morrison wants to tell? And I got to the end, I was like, well, that was amazing. And truthfully, I've never gone back and read the Perez one or anything else from that period of time. But again, no one's asking to talk about that stuff all these years later. So I don't know if anyone else did. But I feel like there's a love and a passion, and more to the point, a very specific theme that Morrison was going for in this work that wasn't necessarily reflected in everything else, which was every once in a while we have to take a step back and realize that a bunch of people with superpowers choosing to help us is the weirdest thing about this, not the superpowers. And let's really show what happens when someone decides to upset the status quo.
That's the thing. Like I said before, this rewards the patience and the rereading and the consideration. And anytime we talk about Morrison, I think I say some version of this where if that's not the reading experience you're looking for, I do get it. I do understand. But I found it worthwhile as a fan, and certainly for purposes of the show, because there's a lot to talk about. I don't, you don't have to put down another writer to elevate someone else, but I do keep referencing these other crisis events and the Scott Snyder Metal Wars and all that stuff. And I got so, in fairness, I think I just consumed too many crises in too short a period of time. But, reading all of it, I just saw, in my view, and others I'm sure can and should disagree, but I just saw such an effort to world build and get into all of this omniversal architecture. But I didn't feel the emotional resonance or the soul that I find in a Grant Morrison work. And that's why I don't know what it would take for me to do another episode on the metal stuff. I think I'm good forever, but I think we'll always kind of come back to the Morrison stuff. And I think that's a big part of the reason why for me.
Yeah. I mean, listen, many people have said this. Jack Kirby said it once, where it was like, you can put the characters in the most ridiculous, out there, hyper imaginative situations you want, as long as they react in an honest way, you will react in an honest way. These stories have to have that emotional core of, this is a person going through this. If it's just a bunch of characters explaining why a bunch of stories that I've never read, or I read once, or someone my parents' age wrote, fit together, I don't care about that. I care about the characters going through this. Like, to go back to the Action Comics run, when Clark is offered the ability to go back and put things the right way and undo, from his point of view, it's Vyndktvx attack, and the real world would be the Flashpoint. It's like, he says, well, no, because that's someone else. This is the life I've been given, and I just earned it back, and I want to keep going with this. And that's kind of what lands for me. It's like, yeah, we don't know what's going to happen next, but we know what he just overcame. So I'm excited to see that. And with everything else, it's like, you're trying to fit together stories that have nothing in common. They were written by different people. They were drawn by different people. They had different editors. They came out at different times. And I love all of this stuff. I really do. I'm a student of it. I'm a fan. But at the end of the day, if how it all fits together is so important for you, you might be missing point of the stories originally? And I always come back to that, where it's like, I want to read the story first and how it all fits together. That's an exercise for being at the store with you guys, or being at the bar, or being at con, or being somewhere else. But that has to be secondary for me to enjoy it.
Yeah. I guess one of my last things, and then we'll sign off. Is there any aspect of this run we didn't talk about that? I mean, I think we were thorough, while at the same time recognizing we can't go through, there's a lot that, we'd be here forever if we went through every single beat of this, but anything we didn't talk about that you wanted to, that we'd be remiss if we didn't address before we wrap up.
The one thing we didn't get to is my favorite part of the story, which is the Super Doom story. Which I think it's really, really important because, Action Comics Volume 2 serves as the second part of an unofficial trilogy. You have Final Crisis and Superman Beyond as the first part. You have this, and then you have the Multiversity, which comes later and deals with Superman analogs. But the story right smack dab in the middle of this thing introduces the character of Super Doomsday, which is the corporate Superman, which is Superman from a world where Jimmy, Lois, and Clark sat down and said, we want to make the world better. And they came up with an idea that could do just that. And you see that they sell the idea to their version of Google or whatever generic omni-brand corporation, in this case being run by Vyndktvx, and they turn this good idea into a world-conquering, hyper brand, something that Morrison's played with in other stories, such as Marvel Boy, and it completely takes over their world, and it pursues Superman analogs in other dimensions, and it keeps going, and it keeps eating, and it keeps consuming, and to me, that is corporatization of Superman. And I'm not saying that's the Superman that you get whenever DC or Warner's or Discovery or someone gets what they want. I'm saying that's the fear. When you take away all of the aspects of the character that speak to the individual, that speak about, again, it's not necessarily rebellion so much as it is compassion, consideration, and helping the most people. Eventually you get Super Doomsday. You get the ultimate thing that's just a symbol, it's just a logo, that's just that S shield with the little TM or the R next to it. It's the creators only getting paid $130 and then getting fired from the books when they complain. It's not getting a pension for fear Neil Adams is going to start a union. It's all the worst stories of capitalism, which is as American as Superman is. It's a cautionary tale, and I think it's so important. And every time I read that, I'm like, how did he get away with this? Like, yeah, it's allegory, but it's so on the nose. I'm happy it's a work that exists. I'm happy it's something that's followed up in Multiversity, and it's something I think about a lot, especially now that we're seeing one Superman movie after another, property after another. Like, he's never been more in the mainstream, and it's just interesting to go back to that and say, well, we have to push more towards Johnny Clark and less towards Super Doomsday. It's a cautionary tale we have to keep in the back of our minds. So that is my favorite part of the story, because I think it's the most pressing for the character on a meta level. And then just two other real quick things. On Mars, they're being attacked by random metal base aliens, the Metalex. Morrison said in an interview that those are based on the Transformers, which I always get a kick out of, which are very big in the UK, and he's from Scotland, so I don't know. But I always get a kick out of that I finally got a Superman Transformers crossover after the official one was canceled. And then finally, something I always go back to because I can't resist comparing the two of them, which I know they both hate. But in Alan Moore's Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, the big villain is revealed to be Mr. Mixius Pitleg, who has decided that he is going to go from being mischievous to being evil. And then in this story written by Grant Morrison, we see what would happen when you got a truly evil fifth dimensional being. And I always thought that was kind of interesting. Like, obviously we don't see evil Mixer Mixes Pitleg, but he might look a little bit like Vyndktvx. So I always like to go back and say, well, was he calling out Alan Moore? I don't know. Maybe. I read Super Gods one too many times, so who knows? I might be reading into it, but that definitely stuck with me.
Oh, thank you for all of that, but I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I had that thought cross my mind. Because whatever happened to the Man Tomorrow, always top of mind, and the fact that you get that reveal of Mixie as the ultimate villain of the piece. The idea of using an evil version of Mixie essentially as the main villain, and not just the main villain of this piece, but just this ultimate adversary who has launched this timeline wide attack. I mean, obviously we can't answer whether that was, a direct nod or what, but yes, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that stood out to me as well.
Yeah, it's certain ideas are very appealing, right? Like the idea of him being bad is interesting because he's got like power. I mentioned before, he can do whatever the creator can do, which is why Superman has to make what he considers to be the ultimate sacrifice in killing someone. But at the end of the day, whether it's him or Vyndktvx or anything else, I love that these are like evil stories, right? Like that's fundamentally what they are. So it's like this idea of a bad one, of someone who only wants to do negative, awful things. Like that is kind of the ultimate foe for Superman, right? Superman wants to help the most people possible. So if you turn that on its axis and you flip it around and you say, well, what's the opposite of that? Well, it's a story that says, no, I can only hurt. I can only take things from you. I can only reduce what you are and kill off your hopes and kill off your dreams and do everything else. And to see Superman fight that and to use everything else in the narrative at his disposal to repel it, including, again, being told about fifth dimensional imps as his bedtime stories on Krypton, it's like everything becomes a tool, becomes a super tool for the best story ever. And that's quoting Grant Morrison. Superman's the best idea we ever had. It shows us a better world that we can one day inhabit. It helps us colonize the future. And to see him fight against the worst story, which is that everything is bad and everything's going to die and nothing matters, is beautiful, because Superman wins, right? And we can remember that in our darkest hours. We can say, no, you know what? Things are bad, but we're going to get through this, and we're going to get through this together. And if we worry about each other, that's going to be the easiest way to make sure it happens.
Because Superman wishes for a happy ending for us.
That's what I'm saying, man. Only Superman can imagine a world where depression, darkness, and control don't exist.
Listen, I can't thank you enough. I always enjoy our conversations, no matter what we talk about, but especially when we talk about Morrison. And I know the audience enjoys when you and Ralph, are the two guys I've talked about Morrison with on the show. And I know the audience always enjoys when you guys come on, because you just have so much passion and insight, and you spend so much time with these works, which is, always lends itself to a great conversation. So I have to thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having. I always tell people the same thing. It's one thing to read this and talk about with someone else, when you're actually talking about someone who's like you, who reads very in depth and is passionate about the work, even if they don't like it. It makes the experience all the more rewarding. It really does. It reinvigorates me, and it gives me an excuse to read the thing a little bit more closely. Right
on. So thank you, Mike. Thank you, audience. I always appreciate you tuning in. Make sure you come back next week for the start of our 6-episode epic all-star Superboy. We'll be charting the journey of Connor Kent across time and media. And Mike, you will be joining me for some of that as well. So make sure you come back for that. And as always, it's about what you do. It's about action. Support the podcast and receive exclusive content, including bonus episodes, by becoming a member at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato. Flat Squirrel Podcasts is home to Digging for Kryptonite and another exciting episode in the adventures of Superman. Please subscribe, rate, and review today, and continue the conversation by joining us on social media. Links are in the show notes. Thank you all